Okay, and we're live. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Environment and Transportation Committee. I am, as always, your friendly chairman, Kumar Barve. I'm joined by my vice chair, Dana Stein, and the members of my committee and several of the people who are going to be testifying today or offering information today on a briefing that is entitled The End of COVID-19 Tenant Protections and Overview of Tenant Assistance Programs. We have a very full slate of witnesses for us today, composed of 5 panels. The first panel is made up of members of the District Court of Maryland. The second panel is the Department of Housing and Community Development. The third, which is the largest, is one that is described as county and municipal perspectives and responses to the effects of COVID-19, and that includes several of the counties, several municipalities, and also the United Way of Central Maryland, because they have been very deeply involved in the successful rollout of the tenant rental assistance programs. The fourth panel is made up of consumer advocates in the Attorney General's office. And the fifth panel is made up, and final panel is made up of folks representing the Maryland Multi-Housing Association, the Apartment and Office Building Association, and the Maryland Retailers. So as a general rule, each panel is intended to take up 15 minutes. We'll have entertain questions from the committee after that panel concludes. The one exception to all of this is that panel 3, which has to do with county, municipalities, and the United Way of Central Maryland, we're going to give them roughly 30 minutes because there's just a lot of them out there to talk with us, and there's just a lot of complex information to be had here. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that today is the birthday of Delegate Barry Silibardi. Hopefully he's going to be able to join us a little later on. But Barry, wherever you are out in the ether, happy birthday to you. We all hope you have a great day today. So let me begin with the District Court of Maryland, 15 minutes, and we have in this order the Honorable John Morrissey, who is the Chief Judge, and then we have Lisa Hall Johnson, who's a District Administrative Judge, along with Sherry Koch, I think I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Haley Weinstein, and Dorothy Wilson. So with that, Judge Morrissey, welcome back to the Environment and Transportation Committee, and you have the floor, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Barve and Vice Chair Stein and members of this committee. It's a privilege to speak before you today, and thank you for inviting us. I'd like to think I have my judicial dream team with me of the 4 administrative, not to be confused with the Olympic men basketball team, because they're not doing so hot, but these are my top judges, the administrative judges that run the districts for Baltimore City, Prince George's, Montgomery County, and Baltimore City, Baltimore County, my big 4. So if you have specific questions for their counties as to how they're implementing their landlord tenant process right now, they'd be happy to answer that. If it would be permissible, Chair, could I share my screen to show the presentation that I've prepared?
Sure, absolutely. Trish, I think we're able to handle that, right?
Okay. Okay, can everybody see that now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. We've done a lot of Zoom hearings in the judiciary, so we're getting a little better at this over time. There's 4 major types of landlord tenant cases that we deal with. The main one is the failure to pay rent cases. That's overwhelming the majority of all the cases, 95 or more % of the cases. And those are simply, have you paid your rent or not paid your rent? And if so, how much is due and owing? Then there's tenant holding over, which I think you all have heard a lot about, and that's where a lease term ends and the landlord can file suit if they give the appropriate notice that they just want to end the tenancy and not rent to these particular tenants anymore. Then there's breach of lease. If there needs to be a substantial breach of lease in the terms, not rent, it has to be something other than rent, and it can be things like danger to the other tenants, things like those type of issues. And then there's wrongful detainer, and that's where there's no landlord-tenant relationship, but someone is in the property, and the owner of that property wants that person to leave. And it can vary from, your adult child that's in the basement that you're done with and want to go, or it could be, you may have read in the paper, some of the sovereign citizens that are squatting on properties these days. The tenant holding over breach of lease and wrongful detainer are a small subsection. And just to give you some idea, I focused on failure to pay rent because that's the overwhelming majority. The sad news is that there's a baseline of evictions that have occurred. These are fiscal year numbers. So you think of that would be fiscal 19 would be July of 2018 to June of 2019, so on and so forth. So there's, on average, there's between 55,000 to 60,000 failure to pay rent cases prior to the pandemic that averaged through the state. And that's been pretty consistent for even years prior to fiscal 19. Right now, if you look over at the gray where my cursor is, we're still significantly below that. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is we're not sure whether or not everyone understood that we've been open this entire time. Now, we haven't been processing at certain times due to the pandemic any landlord-tenant actions, but we've always been open to accept filings. And we're starting to set a lot of those from prior months right now in the bigger jurisdictions. In the smaller jurisdictions, they're more current. They have less of a demand for landlord-tenant, and they tend to be more closer to being caught up than the larger jurisdictions. So you can see we're still off by about 33% from where the filings were before, which is relatively good news. This next slide is just a graphic of where they are, and you can kind of see we were in pretty much a lockdown mode up until July of 2020, and then we started to come up to speed in October, but then the pandemic raised its ugly head again, and we had to go back down to baseline, and now we're up to full functioning. There's a two-part process in the failure to pay rent case type, and that is you have to file the petition for failure to pay rent, and then that will be set in for a hearing, and then the hearing will be conducted in front of a judge. And then if the landlord is successful, they will issue a judgment against the tenant for a money due. It's usually not a money judgment. It's an amount due for possession of the property. So they couldn't go collect on that money, but they can use that as the money that the person needs to pay in order to stay in the property. And you can see that the warrants of restitution, again, average between 18 to 22,000, the blue lines, prior to the pandemic, and we're still significantly below that right now. So and that's through June data. So that's as current data as we have. Again, this is just a graph showing you of how that's going, and it is picking up, but that's been expected because we started full operations back in March. Evictions by fiscal year, again, are off significantly. We average, unfortunately, about 2,000 evictions per month prior to the pandemic. We're a little less than half of that right now. And there's a number of reasons for that also that I'll get to. This is just another graphic of, you can see that, starting in March of 2020, we had one of the case types that we restricted. We really went down to bail reviews, re-reviews, and domestic violence until July. And then we started picking back up, but we're off just from July of 2020 to June of 2021, we are off significantly from where we were before in prior years. A lot of things that people are interested in is the breach of lease filings. Again, they are up from where they were historically in the past, but you can see the numbers are dwarfed in comparison to what we're doing in failure to pay rent cases. And again, these are just filings. They're not necessarily judgments. Wrongful detainer was that case type that I told you where people are illegally in the house, basically. Those have stayed pretty consistent. And I missed one case type here. Tenant holding overs are up significantly over prior years. But again, that number is small in comparison to failure to pay rent cases. A lot of people have been interested in the CARES Act and the CDC agency order and the governor's order. They've been calling them a moratorium. Unfortunately, they're not. They were never a moratorium. They were a prohibition against eviction in certain respects if an individual can qualify for those, what we call an affirmative defense. Through May, we had about 4,500 of these. We expect maybe another 1,000 or so that have come in the preceding months. The CDC agency order prohibition, it stops at the end of this month, and Governor Hogan's stops at on August 15th. What we did is when these cases came to trial, these were fully litigated cases where the tenant showed up, they made their arguments, the judge accepted their arguments that they did, the affirmative defense did apply to them, and then we held those judgments aside. Those will be entered in once the moratoriums or so-called moratoriums are lifted. But I've added an additional element to what's required, and that's, I'm having a little time scrolling down here. I issued on June 30th a communication out to everyone indicating that those reserve judgments, when the second step is filing the warrant of restitution after you have the judgment, when someone files a warrant of restitution for one of those cases that has a reserve judgment, those will now have to be set in. In the past, they previously were just done in chambers. Now they'll have to be set in for a hearing. And the reason that we did that was because of the lapse of time occurring. Some of these cases may have occurred in as early as July of last year, and no one's quite sure whether or not those monies are still owed. I would suspect that the more commercial landlords know that and would have dismissed the case. Mom and pops, which are a considerable part of the workload that we do in the district court, may not know that. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a additional element of due process to ensure that those judgments that were entered perhaps in July or September of last year are still valid judgments, and they go. We've used the Maryland Court Help Centers. That's a network of legal providers that we have throughout the state. And I'm proud to say that we have them in the big 4 counties now, with the addition of the Montgomery County Help Center that we opened on July 1st. And actually, we opened one in Catonsville in Baltimore County during the height of the pandemic in March of last year. Those are walk-in centers, and we have them in Baltimore City and in Prince George's, as well as in Salisbury and in Frederick counties. But we also have a call-in center, and that's open from 8:30 in the morning until 8 p.m. Monday through Friday, and anyone can call in, they can email, they can chat. In June of 2020, I sent out a request to all the county executives across the state to ask for their assistance in providing us with whatever rental assistant resources that they had. And when they responded, those were channeled into what we call a knowledge base in the court help centers, so that they're staffed by attorneys through legal aid, that those attorneys at the help center can readily provide that information to any individual that calls in. We've helped over 100,000 individuals with their civil legal needs this last year. And we've helped over 30,000 individuals since March of 2020 with just landlord tenant related cases. And we really hit the right demographics in this, that 50% of the individuals that call make less than $30,000 and 75% make less than $50,000. So you can kind of see just some graphics of the phone calls that we do and instances of service and the different types of service that we do: phone, the walk-ins, and the chats. Overwhelmingly, housing has been the largest call-in questions, and so we were happy to provide that service. And then one other item that you guys may have remembered from this last session is that House Bill 18 was passed, and that requires a notice to be provided by the landlord to the tenant 10 days prior to filing a failure to pay rent case. And we have this form now. It's in final stage. We still accept anyone reviewing it. We have a forms review process that if someone wants to suggest a change, they're more than welcome. We actually have a form for the form request change. We do a lot of forms in the district court, and we will certainly consider any corrections or additions to the form. Space is always limited on these forms, but a new item that we've added, and this is the first form that we're doing it to, is a QR code. The big revolution in that is that you used to have to download an app for these, but now if you just use your photo on your iPhone, you can pull that up and it'll take you directly to the Maryland Court Help Centers. And so that'll be the first one that we put the form on. We're going to put it on all of our forms if we can find space on them. And then as part of that notice, we have to provide all the nonprofit legal services organizations for eviction help for each of the counties on there. And we have that all prepared and ready to go. It's important to note that we've heard a lot about a tsunami coming of eviction cases, and I agree necessarily that there'll be a tsunami of cases. And for a number of reasons, that a lot of the cases have been dismissed because they've occurred in prior months. So if in July a judgment was entered against a tenant of last year and they paid in September, that judgment's no longer effective. It's of no value, and the landlord can't file the next step, the warrant of restitution, to do that. So we're seeing very few tenants and landlords coming into court. That will pick up, I'm sure, but our past experience has been lots and lots of dismissals. And typically we average about 33% or more dismissals right at before the case even comes before a judge. Right now we're up in the 50 to 60% range. The other is that until the pandemic is over or the CDC changes its requirements with respect to unvaccinated individuals, they will still need to, when they enter a courthouse, to wear a mask and, more importantly, to socially distance. And by that requirement of socially distancing, we cannot put as many people in dockets as we had historically in the past. We can't cram them in like fish, right? We have to socially distance. And so I was asked this question before, and I would say, what percentage are we operating at right now in the district court? And I would say, and it varies from court to court, but I would say on average at about 75% of what we were able to do prior to the pandemic. And that's directly as the result of the continuing state of the COVID emergency right now. So with that said, I've concluded my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions from anyone. And if anyone has any specific questions with respect to the big four counties, I'd ask those judges to step up.
Okay, so are the other judges here to answer questions, or are they making, you've gotten through 13 minutes here, so were they intending—
Just to answer questions, Chairman.
Okay, great. Let me just say that as a professional number cruncher, I really love the charts you had to present to us. It looks like by hook or by crook, we've managed to avoid a eviction tsunami. So in any case, we've got a question from, before I recognize Delegate Jalisi, there are two things I want to say. I think he was the first. There are two things I'd like to say, and they are, number one, I've had a little bit of a problem in my apartment building here, and sometimes the fire alarm goes off. And if that happens, the vice chairman will take over. And number two, now that he is here, Delegate Ciliberti, happy birthday. It's great to acknowledge you and your birthday, and you're one of our favorites. So let me recognize first Delegate Jalisi, then Delegate Terraza, and then Delegate Holmes in that order. Jay, you're up, and congratulations, you just got married. So congratulations to you as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Judge Morrissey, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Delegate.
I had a few questions. One is, how long is it taking for you to schedule a failure to pay rent case? In the past, it used to be within 5 days of filing. So what is the average time now that you're scheduling it, or will be scheduling in the future?
That's a good question, Delegate. The 5 days has kind of gone by the wayside as the result of the pandemic. So really what we're focusing on is getting caught up on the prior filings. And that's for a large reason why we're seeing a lot of dismissals again, because these may have occurred a year ago and they're just coming to trial now. I don't think we're that far behind, but I think through the first of the year, we're okay. So we're still scheduling them every day. It's just we're working on the backlog right now from oldest to youngest.
So the law hasn't changed. It's just because of the backlog? Because I see in Baltimore County, it's taking about 3 months for failure to pay rent. For tenant holding over, it's about 6 months.
It's part that and part the limited ability of we can't have the same numbers of people in the courtrooms as we could in the past.
I know, but you also have to understand that not every landlord owns 1,000 units. Some of the minority, especially landlords, may have a rental property which pays for their mortgage and property tax. And if you end up with a tenant who is not paying, then you can't pay a mortgage or property tax. So
I understand perfectly, Delegate, and we're trying to be as fair and impartial to everyone in this process. I get letters from landlords every day, and I get letters from tenants every day, and I'm very sensitive to both of their issues. And we're under the circumstances that we find ourselves, we're trying to process everything as efficiently as we can.
So moving this along, if a tenant who is not getting rent ends up in foreclosure, so how is the court handling any potential foreclosure cases? Because I'm sure you understand that while we cannot have a lot of people being evicted from their apartments or houses, we also cannot afford a bunch of foreclosures in our communities, because each foreclosure damages the value of every house in that particular neighborhood. So how will you handle foreclosure cases? Because I understand as the emergency ends, that moratorium the governor had put in for lenders not to be able to file with the registry for foreclosure is also going to end. So how are you going to protect the small homeowner?
Okay, let's let the judge answer.
Sure, and that's a great question. Foreclosures are in the province of the circuit court. However, you did mention that the governor's order that stopped evictions also stopped foreclosures. What I would do is encourage everyone, and that's been a big part of what we've been doing. I've talked to the Secretary of Housing as recently as yesterday. I talk to him all the time about trying to get the word out that there's these resources that are available to everyone, both landlords and tenants. They can both apply, and they should be doing that because we have a lot of money to still send out to everyone. We've already spent a lot, but we have a lot more, is my understanding, that can be spent. So I would encourage them to apply. And if they call the self-help center, we'll hook them up.
Just for clarification for everyone on the committee, and I'm sure you already know this, the moratorium on foreclosure, late fees, and all that was only applicable under the governor's order for federally backed mortgages. People who have mortgages from private lenders or banks who are not federally backed were not honoring the governor's moratorium. And that's what you will see, because people who go to those lenders are people typically with lower income to debt ratio and lower FICO scores. And that, again, I see a lot of my Black and brown community members getting stuck with. So when you talk to the secretary again, please make sure that he understands that the governor's moratorium, most people thought that it is for all people who have mortgages, but it was only for people who got it from Fannie Mae or any other federally backed lender, not from a whole bunch of other lenders who people usually go to who have lower FICO scores or high debt income ratio.
Okay, Judge, unless you have something to add, I'd like to move on to Delegate Terraza.
I do not, Chairman.
Okay, Delegate Terraza.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chief Judge Morrissey, for being here and for all that information. Two things I wanted to ask about. I wanted to go back. There were some slides that I didn't see you cover that had to do with breach of lease and tenant holding over cases, and I was somewhat alarmed by those two. Wondering if you could, I think there were around 9 or 10 maybe.
Bear with me, I'm trying to get to, there's breach of lease filings.
Right, and it looked to me like those were up dramatically.
Well, they are, but remember the numbers, these are filings. So there were 33,000 failure to pay rent filings, but there were only 251 breach of lease. Now it is up 100% from July of 19 so it's doubled, but the numbers are still minuscule in terms of failure to pay rent cases.
And the other, this is a breach of lease, and then the tenant holding over.
Tenant holding overs are up significantly also. Again, but 626 filings. Now, if
you add those two together, it seems like that's a lot.
I mean, you could consider that. I don't, only because there's 33,000 filings. And just because they file doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to win. They have to prove the elements, and they have to have done the notice correctly in the tenant holding over case. Yeah. And we won't, in a breach of lease, we won't let people disguise a failure to pay rent case as some other case. Now, they may have both. In a tenant holding over, the person may not be paying the rent, and they may be beyond the term of their lease. That's entirely possible. But we're not going to hear the failure to pay. We're going to focus on the tenant holding over because that's the case style that they filed. And I've done tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these cases myself. And I've never let someone disguise one of these cases as something other than what it's supposed to be. You have to follow the statute. And I think most of our judges do that.
Absolutely. No, I don't think that I wouldn't, I'm not accusing you of doing that whatsoever. I'm just worried that a lot of the failure to pay are turning into tenant holding over cases over time, since this has been going on for what, 12 to 18 months. I assume at some point they become a tenant holding over cases.
It may be if the person's behind on their rent and their lease term is up, they may file under a tenant holding over rather than a failure to pay.
And do you have any data on how many of these have been successful? Because these were able to go forward.
Only they were only able to go forward in most of the stages on an emergency basis. So that added another element on there. And the judges were screening those to determine whether or not they thought they were emergent. The only number that I can tell you are the evictions numbers, because that's where it would end up. It goes into the pile of whether it's a failure to pay. You end up with the net result of being able to file a warrant of restitution if you're successful on any of the case types. And then you would go for an eviction after that.
Okay. And then the other question, thank you, Chief Judge, I appreciate that. And the other question I had to do with this, I guess I'm still concerned about the tsunami, and I appreciate that I hope you're right that we're not going to have the tsunami. I guess I'm wondering if this, let me see if I understand this correctly. All of the judgments will be entered. Is that on, I'm sorry, I forgot what you said. Is that on August 15th or that's on July 31st?
The CDC agency orders will be entered on July 31st. We believe those are a smaller proportion of those 4,500 that I showed you, because it's harder to prove the CDC agency order than it is the governor's order.
Oh, I see.
So if I were an attorney going into court, I would go for the governor's order because it's easier to prove. There's less elements.
So once,
and I didn't mean to say that there's not going to be I don't believe there might be a tsunami, like a tidal wave coming all in 1 month or the next month. It'll be a slower burn till we get back up to full-blown operations. And it may very well, the number of evictions may increase over the baseline, but that's going to take a while still. And if people are successful in getting the resources that are available, in fact, these have gone out. This is from the Secretary of Housing, and they've been sending these out, at least and I'm pretty sure across the state, but I know at least in Anne Arundel County, because members of my staff have gotten these, and their notices that there is help for individuals that are behind on their rent.
So are you sending the information about those judgments? Are you able to share the information about those judgments that are about to be entered with the counties or with the whoever's got the money? I know, like in some of the counties, it's being run by private nonprofits, but are you able to share the specifics so that those the folks that have the rental assistance are able to reach out to the specific people who are facing eviction? Is that information you're able? My understanding is in some counties that's happening, in some counties it's not happening.
You're probably right. We have information in all our clerks' offices for individuals that come into court. These people, again, the ones that have been reserved have all come to court and would have had the ability to go into the clerk's office and receive this information. We also changed our forms. First, we did it, I realized pretty early on that we were going to need to hook up tenants and landlords with rental resources. And we started doing just stickers that we put on each of the forms. And that was in June and July up and through October, and until we could get, it takes about 90 days to change a form. And now we have it on the form itself that tells where the rental assistance is. So hopefully between the combination of those two, those individuals that have these judgments are aware of the resources that are available to them.
You know, I appreciate that. Are you able to share the information? Because that puts the burden on you guys, and I appreciate what you've been doing, but
it's a manual. It's still in paper form, these, so I wouldn't have a way to transmit them electronically to anyone.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Delegate Holmes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And It's great to see you, Chief Judge. You've done an excellent job. And like the chair, I share his appreciation of actual factual numbers. I had 3 questions. 2 have already been answered. One was the tsunami, and the other was the reasoning for the breach of lease and the tenant holding over cases. So you've answered those 2 questions, which is great. The other question I have is relevant to the forms and the form review process that you have. As chair of the Housing and Real Property Subcommittee, I'm sure you can imagine my phone has been ringing off of the hook here since this whole thing got started. One of the things that I'm still getting calls about is the MDE lead paint number on the failure to pay rent form. And I do understand that there was a process where Maryland Department of Environment and the judiciary system were attempting to coordinate with having the MDE number be verified as a factual MDE lead paint number. I'm just trying to figure out if the process of that verification has taken place and what the status is.
You would have to ask MDE that. I know I sent a letter to the chair earlier on. There are some issues that we have with that. With a judge is not permitted ethically to investigate a case. We do review the forms to ensure that the number is there. If it's not there, that case would be dismissed. But actually investigating whether that case, that number that they put on is a real and correct number is not within the province of the judiciary. That would be an item that would need to be raised by the participants in court. And they would have the obligation to prove that to the court.
Yeah, that's part of the issue. I do recognize how your responsibilities are limited in that fact, but we've got to figure out a way to get that cross verification some kind of way. Chief Judge, as I indicated, it's always good to see you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate. I appreciate all you've done over the pandemic also.
Thank you. And for a second bite at the apple, Delegate Chilisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just 2 questions about the timeline. One is about the money judgment you mentioned, Judge Morrissey. Is there a standard policy of how a money judgment can be obtained by a landlord in a failure to pay rent case in all the counties and your jurisdictions, or is it county by county?
Well, my understanding is that it's statewide, that you have to, if you want a money judgment associated with a failure to pay rent form, you'd have to personally serve the tenant, in addition to the mailing and the posting notice that the sheriffs or constables do for us.
No, my issue is in Baltimore County, you can have a private process server serve it, but in Baltimore City, it goes judge by judge. Some judges only accept it if it's served by the sheriff, while other judges accept it even if you do it by private process. So can you standardize this policy one way or the other?
I think that would need to be legislation, Delegate, respectfully.
And then the second question is regarding the new law that just passed by the Baltimore City Council, which says that you cannot not renew somebody's lease except for certain conditions, and even if they have not paid rent for a long time. So how do you think the court is gonna make a decision on this? So if I have a property and I want to sell it, it looks like I have to continue renting it, because unless I have a relative moving in or one of those 3 or 4 conditions, I can't sell the property if I have a tenant in it, because I can't cancel the lease.
Well, let me just suggest, Judge, before you answer that, I think that question wanders outside the ambit of the COVID-19 tenant protections, although it's an important issue, and I do want our committee to look at it. So if you could just very briefly answer that, and then I have a question from Delegate Peraza and then Delegate Ruth in that order.
Sure, we're aware of it. I know I've sent over things to Judge Weinstein, and I'm sure she shared it with her judges. They'll apply the law as it's stated. That's really all I could say about that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Delegate, actually, Delegate Ruth and then Delegate Peraza in that order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Judge Morrissey, for your presentation. This has been very, very informative. I really appreciate your time. And I just wanted to try to get a little clarification. You said you're not expecting a tsunami of evictions, but you said there will be a slow burn as we ramp up. Can you give a little better sense of what that means by a slow burn? Can we expect higher than normal for some months as we get back to the normal average?
That's a great question, Delegate. And I wish I had a better answer for you other than, we're kind of living month to month right now. We've since the beginning, Chief Judge Barbera has, all of her orders have been based on either the CDC advice or our Maryland Department of Health and Dr. His name is escaping me right now, but he's a wonderful doctor and he's been very instrumental to the judiciary in advising us on how to proceed on these things. And I had a discussion with Chief Judge Barbera as recent as last week. In my opinion was that until the CDC changes its advice with respect to unvaccinated individuals, we can't really move any faster than we're moving right now. So if you think that we're only at 75% or maybe even less in some jurisdictions, that's what we're kind of stuck at right now, as I see, until something happens. I don't know when that something is going to happen, and I don't see it coming today or tomorrow. So we'll continue. We've staggered our dockets to limit the amount of people in a courtroom at any particular time. So before we used to start, say, at 9 o'clock and have a docket set of 300, we're now doing it at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and we would set them in at 75 or 80 per hour. Again, a lot of the people, both landlords and tenants, aren't showing up. Pre-pandemic, about 3% of the tenants showed up. Post-pandemic, we're averaging a little bit higher than that, but not much.
Thank you. So you're talking about the actual eviction cases. Are we expecting to see an increase in filings?
I would anticipate that there would be back up to the, I don't know why they would come down from the base level. Well, I shouldn't say that. Perhaps the rental relief, I know that the secretary has given out a fair amount of money and there have been different chunks of money. I don't entirely understand exactly what it is, but as early as June of last year, I was trying to hook tenants up with rental resources because they were available then. It's been my understanding it's been more standardized since March of this year, in that it's really starting to show more and more effects as we go through this. But I don't know if it'll come back up to where it was prior to the pandemic. It seems like the rental assistance is helping though.
Thank you.
Okay, Delegate Terraza.
Yeah, really quickly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really quickly, because I think Delegate Ruth pretty much got to what I was asking. Are you able to quantify that? I know you said it was 75% down, but like, so what approximately, how many evictions would you expect to be processed in a month based on, so it's like 25% of 4,500 in a year. Is that what we're looking at?
I don't know as you could do that math, Delegate. It's, it's, we're moving month to month. We've never been in this situation before in the history of the judiciary, as far as I know. And we're estimates of what the behavior of landlords are going to be is impossible for us to predict. It's, they're filing, we just can't move. I can tell you, it's, we can't move any quicker than we're moving right now. And that's at a lesser speed than we did before. So, and there is some finite limit to the sheriff's department resources to how many people they can evict on a given day or month.
Right. Yeah. My concern just isn't that you're not getting to them fast enough. It's that to get a sense of what resources we need to make sure are in place to meet the needs of those who are going to be then homeless after they face eviction. But I really appreciate all the information. Thank you.
Sure. And I would encourage everyone to come to court. And that's not just for landlord tenant cases. It seems that nothing good happens if you don't show up for court. It's always better to come to court.
Okay, Delegate Lehman, and I think you might be the last question here, and we'll be able to move on to the second panel. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually in the Bronx right now, walking on about to go on a tour of Fordham for my daughter, but I've been listening intently. And Judge Morrissey, thank you for your great work. You were very helpful to me on one of my housing bills last session. I did want to know if in all of this and this potential tsunami of evictions, whether there is any, I guess, mechanism or a tool to determine if in fact all of these rentals are legal on the front end, that these are valid rental situations. For example, I think you know what I'm getting at. Do these landlords that are attempting to evict in fact have licenses in the first place and are meeting the requirements of the law in whatever jurisdiction they're renting?
That is on the forms as a requirement to obtain a judgment. You would have to supply that information to the court.
Okay, at what point do you have to supply it though? Is it at the end stage? Is it in the beginning? Where along the way are landlords supplying that proof?
Well, they have to fill out the form. If they leave the form blank in either of those two, the case will be dismissed. But then it's up to the parties. Again, we're it's an advocacy-based system or adversary-based system where the people would have to raise those issues in court. Obviously, when I would look at a failure to pay rent form, if I knew what our numbers look like license numbers looked at, and if they were wildly different from that, I would inquire. But we're not really supposed to inquire just on our own. We're supposed to let the parties, play out their case, both on the plaintiff side and on the defense side.
Okay, so when you say let the parties know, there is an effort for both sides, for both the tenant and the landlord. But again, it seems like it's not proactive, that it's after the case is already sort of, landed.
Well, again, we're not supposed to investigate as judges. We're not the regulatory arm of the housing department. That's not our function. Our function is to be a neutral and unbiased forum, and people have to raise the defenses. We have some discretion, but it's really our basis is that we're not supposed to assist either side in presenting their case. They're supposed to present their cases, and if it meets the qualifications that we have, then we do it or don't do it, depending on what happens.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I guess I just would say respectfully, I would submit there needs to be some changes then in law. I think the burden of proof should be proving that you're legally renting at least, not so much the merits of an eviction, but proving that you're legally renting should be on the landlord. It should not be on the tenant to say this is an illegal rental. Often they don't know the law or don't know the rules in the jurisdiction where they're renting. But thank you for that. I believe
there was a bill, I don't know if it was your bill, Delegate, or one of the other bills, and we suggested that if at trial, that would be an item of proof that individuals would have to bring with them, and they could bring it I remember talking about electronically, because a lot of people store their records electronically. That is a method that was discussed, and I can't remember, I don't believe that bill got passed, but that was a discussion in this last session, and I think the session before also.
Yes, and I thank you. That I do believe that's one of the solutions, and that was there were two similar bills brought by myself and Delegate Attar. But I can talk to you again offline about that. But thank you again for your time and for your service.
Thank you, Delegate.
All right, Judge. Thank you very much. I want to compliment you, sir. We had a public hearing during one of the sessions, and you stayed around longer than you needed to and listened to the testimony on either side. And I very much appreciated you giving your time to the committee in that fashion. And I, of course, appreciate the presentation that you and your colleagues have made to our committee in this instance as well. So thank you very much.
And Chairman, thank you and all the delegates and the senators for your hard work. I know this has been a trying last 16 months, and Who'd have thought we'd ever be through this? But I'm proud of the state and the situation that we're in right now, and I'll continue. I am going to stay on for this because I want to hear what everyone else has to say to make sure I'm not missing anything. And I'm sorry that you guys didn't get to hear from my administrative judges. They'll yell at me later that I wasted their time, but I needed them there for moral support, if not anything else. So thank you, ladies, for coming on, and thank you, Delegate.
Okay, Chief Judge, thank you very much. Let's go to panel number 2, which is the Department of Housing and Community Development. First up is going to be Carol Gilbert, and then Matt Heckles, and collectively you have 15 minutes, and then we will go to questions. So Carol, you have the floor. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Barbie and Vice Chair Stein and members of the committee for inviting us to join you and provide this update. I am joined by Matt Heckles, who is Assistant Secretary for Development Finance, and will address one of the vehicles that DHCD has designed for rental assistance. And I'm also joined by my colleague Danielle Meister, who is our resident expert on federal guidelines for rental assistance, and also important at this moment because she's our technical expert and is driving the PowerPoint that you'll see today. At the outset, we'd also particularly like to thank the 6 members of the Maryland General Assembly who volunteered a substantial amount of time earlier this year as advisors to the design and implementation of our emergency rental assistance program. And those are Senators McCray, Hettleman, and West, and Delegates Lewis, Griffith, and Stewart. Their guidance and their questions, their particularly great questions, were really crucial to the launch of the program I'm going to talk about today. We have at DHCD, in collaboration with our local government partners and nonprofits, really been in full gear since last spring in providing rental assistance from federal and state and local resources in order to address and prevent housing instability. So I'll be saying more about the deployment of those resources last year, and also into the more substantial resources we've been allocated this year. The presentation will focus principally on 2 topics the committee has asked us to address. Number 1, the methodology and the status of funding that we've deployed, and number 2, information about key federal reporting and documentation and household eligibility requirements. So with that, we'll move to slide 2. And this slide summarizes the amazing level of resources we've been allocated between 2 tranches of the ERAP program, starting in early this year with the transition between presidential administrations. We've been getting guidance on how to deploy that funding since then in 5 or 6 different updates from Treasury. But I think it's very important to note that well before these resources were made available, the department was deploying other state and federal resources totaling nearly $60 million, $58.7 million to be exact. And that funding was deployed through several different vehicles, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, the Emergency Solutions Program, the new Coronavirus Relief Program. And those funds assisted nearly 25,000 households pay their rent and stay in their homes. This state deployed funding was in addition, it's important to note, to funds that went directly to local governments, principally county governments, the larger jurisdictions, which also had access to direct funding through the CDBG and ESG and CRF programs. With respect to ERAP, the funding that's now on the table and is being deployed, of the $400 and so million, $258 million is being deployed directly by DHCD, and $192 million of that is now under contract with our 24 local government partners and is actively in deployment. And then I'll talk about the balance of that funding, which is being deployed through our Affordable Housing Relief Program, which is important support for those affordable housing developments that DHCD has financed through the years. And more than 400 properties were supported last year alone with $15 million in support. We'll say more about tranche number 2, ERAP 2.0, as we're calling it, a little bit later in the presentation, but those funds can only be tapped after 75% of ERAP 1 is tapped. So moving on to the next slide, just to reinforce that we have deployed with our 24 local government partners, $192 million in rent relief. 8 of those partners started deploying those programs early on, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. This slide I'm not going to dwell on. It just says the kinds of activities and support that the ERAP funds can help. One question the committee asked was whether or not we're requiring a certain amount of the funding that we're allocating to go to rental utility assistance. And the answer to that question is no, we're not requiring it. We're allowing local discretion in how they design the proportion of rental assistance to utility assistance. We are encouraging that these ERAP funds focus on rental assistance because there are other funds provided by the federal government and by the General Assembly for utility assistance that we think is going a long way to catch people up on utility arrears. So next slide, please. This slide talks about how a household, the kinds of documentation and eligibility parameters that a household has to present in order to become eligible for rental assistance. I think the slide itself is fairly simple, but in actuality, this is where sometimes the timing and the time it takes to become approved for rental assistance is really based on qualifying the household. Obviously, the income, as you probably already know, is set at a max of 80% of area median income, which can be proven either by a couple of months employment information or last year's tax returns. Also, the tenant has to prove that they are they do have a rental obligation. They also have to prove they have a financial hardship, and they have to show that they are at risk for housing instability and displacement. While a number of these elements can be self-certified, for the most part, these eligibility components must be supported by documentation. So each of our local programs and their sub-partners, their nonprofit partners, know that there are certain things that they have to collect from each household in order to document their eligibility. Next slide, please. So as we develop the program with support from our General Assembly advisors, we really focused on 3 guiding principles. Equity, that is that we want the funds to reach the households in the most need and at the most risk of displacement. And this has included a very aggressive marketing campaign that is culturally specific, so that we're reaching people in different demographic groups and languages. We also have taken care to deploy the state's portion of funding in the most low barrier way. We're not adding unnecessary bureaucratic requirements. It's already hard enough to qualify eligible households and document the process prior to awards. So we really are focused on maintaining a low barrier approach. And we emphasize a locally driven and designed, a flexibility that is locally driven and designed. And we've consulted prior to the deployment of the overall program, we've consulted with our local government partners, the biggest 8 that got their own direct funding, the smaller rural partners, our continuum of care nonprofits, and our community action agencies, which are some of the the principal partners with their local governments, to get feedback on how to be low barrier and how to meet their local needs. With respect to the funding methodology, as described on the next slide, I've mentioned that we worked closely with the Maryland General Assembly work group. The initial allocation from Treasury to the department and to other 8 jurisdictions, 8 largest jurisdictions, was based simply on population, so it didn't meet what we thought of as important equity considerations. So we did research and work to come up with a methodology that right-sized the state's allocation to local governments so that the jurisdictions with the largest needs in terms of vulnerable households would get a larger share of our allocation, and we'll show you that in just a moment. We used a nationally recognized and applauded tool issued by the Urban Institute to identify those census tracts in each jurisdiction where there's a high concentration of the most vulnerable residents, vulnerable to eviction. We prioritized our marketing and outreach to those census tracts. We made them accessible to our local government partners so that they would know where they could also focus their outreach. And the next slide. So in the end, we came to a framework that focused on government local awards of $192.9 million to 24 jurisdictions, and then 15% of the DHCD award, $40 million, to continue the successful assisted housing relief program to maintain stability of residents who are in affordable housing financed by DHCD. And then we have held back a small reserve that will be likely deploying soon to address the high spenders, the fast spenders. And then we retained a very small amount, 2%. We were allowed 10%, but we retained only 2%, principally focused on outreach and aggressive outreach and marketing campaign, which we'll talk about in just a second. So that is a summary of what the state allocated, and combining that with the $143 million that went directly to the largest 8 jurisdictions, we come to the $401 million. And the next slide shows how that $258 million breaks down. Just as a kind of as a good example of the right sizing I mentioned in terms of equity, you'll notice that in the second column, there are the amounts allocated to the 8 largest jurisdictions, and Anne Arundel County and Baltimore County received a very similar amount, although Baltimore City has a much higher number of lower income renting households. So the first column reflects the right sizing of the state's allocation to address which jurisdictions have the largest number of lower income and vulnerable, prospectively vulnerable households. And then at the bottom of this chart, we add in, the $40 million for assisted housing relief, the reserves, and the small amount of DHCD admin. And the remaining 8% of admin and housing services funds that are critical to staffing local programs, we made available to the local programs. Next slide. Now that I've said so much, I'm going to ask Matt Heckles if he might want to add anything related to DHCD's Assisted Housing Relief Program, which is directly administered by his team.
Thank you, Carol.
Roughly 3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
We'll speak quickly. I just want to reiterate a little bit of what Carol said. This program, I think, exemplifies how we focused on making sure that we were focused on the most needy populations. The assisted housing stock in the state of Maryland is financed by CDA with low-income housing tax credits and state funds. These are individuals who must meet income eligibility to live in these apartment complexes. And so we wanted to make sure that we had the lowest barrier possible access to this program. So we worked with the management companies, most of whom are nonprofits, and the developers and the owners and landlords of these sites, to make sure that we were communicating directly with them and creating a program where they could go and get the tenant self-certifications and certifications that are required by the federal regulations, but then batch those applications to us in a much more low barrier, much faster way. So this program really launched about over a year ago with the Corona Relief Funds. And as Carol mentioned earlier, but I'll reiterate, we spent about $15 million to assist about 10,000 month units of rent during that phase of the program that ran through December. This new federal funding came into play and we opened in May again. We have around $6 million or so already since May in applications for rent relief under this program. So very, very successful and a streamlined way to make sure that we're accessing the most vulnerable population of tenants in the state, as well as supporting good actors when it comes to providing low-income rental housing for people in the state of Maryland.
Okay, and I will blitz through the remaining slides. I'm actually, I've already mentioned that the Maryland General Assembly Advisory Group met in February and March. We designed and implemented with community input the program and launched it in March and April. And all programs that we funded were open for service in mid-May, May 17th. And we are now continuing with our input, constant contact with our local partners as to their concerns, their questions. And we're also starting to provide treasury reporting as required on a monthly basis and a quarterly basis. Next slide. I'm not going to go into this slide, but it's a very good one to show the immense amount of work that our communications team has done in proactively reaching out to many different populations. The judge mentioned the postcards people are getting, but we're also using our website and social media and some very creative commercials and YouTube videos, and really the whole range of ways to touch and reach our vulnerable households. Next slide shows some of the results of that outreach. 5,000 commercials, 13,000 calls to our call center, et cetera. Next slide. And this slide shows a little bit more about our culturally specific reach to African-American and Spanish-speaking.
Begin to wind up. I've got 5 people who want to ask questions.
Okay, very good. And I think we're close to the last 1 or 2 slides. If we move on to the next one, I've already mentioned that we have deployed in 2020 $58.7 million, and followed by in 2021 the ERAP funding that we've deployed of $192 million. Next slide. Next slide. Yes, this slide. The $140 million that the local governments have deployed so far, they've gotten close to $40 million out the door. Prince George's, I applaud for particularly being ahead of the pack. The next slide shows just a little bit more about the money that's spent.
We're really going to have to wrap up
Okay.
here because we have 7 people who want to ask questions.
Okay.
So let me just go straight to questions.
Next slide though, Danielle. But I want to address the next slide.
Okay, so the questions are going to be in this order. Delegate Stewart, Delegate Love, Ruth, Jalisi, Terraza, the Vice Chair, and Delegate Healy. So Delegate Vaughn Stewart, you have the floor.
Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I really enjoyed serving on the ERAP work group and continue to serve on the ERAP work group with y'all. I really commend
You know, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you there, Vaughn. Could you do something? Maybe you need to.
What about now, Mr. Chairman? Is that any better?
A little better.
Okay. Talk loudly.
Well, go ahead and try and ask your question.
Okay, I'll talk loudly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So I really enjoyed serving on the ERAP work group. I commend the agency's work on the program. I just have a couple of quick questions. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. First, according to the National Equity Atlas, about 19% of Maryland renter households, which it translates to about 130,000 households, are still facing a rent delinquency that could end in eviction. 78% of those households are people of color. And so I think everyone on the call, and certainly I know the agency recognizes the urgency of getting money out the door as quickly as possible. I think one thing that people may not realize, however, on the committee, perhaps some of my colleagues, is that per ERAP's governing statute, I think it's section 501D, the Treasury Department plans to recapture ERAP 1 funds from state and local jurisdictions that haven't spent at least 65% of the funds by the end of September. And so, Ms. Gilbert or whoever, if you could just give me an update on where we are, both in terms of the Maryland funds and the direct grantee funds to the counties, of what percentage are we at? Because obviously the last thing we would want is for the federal government to come in and quote unquote recapture the funds because we didn't spend them fast enough.
Correct. We are sprinting to that deadline, and we take it very seriously, Delegate Vaughn. The local allocations of $143 some million have been approximately 30% spent, and as you would imagine, they're choosing to spend that allocation first. Those largest 8 jurisdictions comprise 80 some percent of our renting households in Maryland. And the state supplement that is going both to those largest allocations and also the rural allocations is about $35 million committed, which is a little less than 20%. But we're seeing that, I mean, since mid-May and with some programs opening earlier, we've really seen a sharp increase in that trajectory of expenditure. But we are not taking anything for granted. We are very seriously focused on that deadline and that milestone, I would say. Treasury is not required to claw back money, but we're not taking it for granted that they may intend to do so.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, so we're at roughly, depending on the jurisdiction, between 20 and 30% spent. And so we've got to basically double our number in the next 2 months.
2 months. Yes.
Okay. All right. Wow. So that seems like a sort of a hair on fire situation from my vantage point. But okay, I'm glad that you are taking it seriously. So relatedly to that, and secondly, I know one of the issues that we talked about on the work group was the ability of tenants to receive rental assistance funds directly when the landlords refuse to participate in the program. And just for the benefit of my colleagues, where we basically landed on that was to leave it up to individual counties to decide how to figure that out and how to sort of figure out that problem. Do you have any sort of data or reporting from the counties on which percentage of them are allowing tenants to receive funds directly when their landlords don't want to participate?
We require that they have that path, that tenants, and in fact, the statute requires that they have a path whereby tenants can apply directly. And the larger jurisdictions particularly are geared toward a tenant-focused approach. And
Okay.
I don't have statistics on that, but I'll ask that question as to whether we can get that.
Okay, great. And I think we're actually the work group's meeting tomorrow. So that's sort of a preview of maybe what I want to chat a little bit about to make sure that money is being done well by the counties. And then lastly, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I mean, I think everyone knows, the General Assembly passed landmark legislation this past session to create an access to counsel program. And what people may not realize is that actually we have an opportunity to spend some of these ERAP funds to fund the access to counsel program based on the eligibility I won't run through all the federal statute of what percentage we can spend on, but it's a fair amount of money that we could divert from both, especially from ERAP 2, if we get there, towards the state's access to counsel program to make sure that every tenant has every vulnerable tenant has an access to an attorney. So I guess I would certainly urge you to consider that. I think some of the renter groups had urged the state to commit some of that funding to that program. And so I guess my final question is just, what have been the internal conversations within the agency about committing some funding to both eviction diversion and also towards the right to counsel program to get that funded? And basically, where are we at with that?
Well, for ERAP 1, all of the 10% of admin and housing related services were committed to our local government partners, except for the 2% I mentioned. So it's not possible with ERAP 1, but it's certainly something we want to talk about with you and internally relative to ERAP 2.
Okay, great. And I guess with ERAP 1, really the best we can hope for at this point is just to encourage local jurisdictions, especially those that are slow to pump out money, to use the funds that they've been allocated towards their own legal assistance program.
Correct. And we also were given an additional $2 million by the governor's office in the budget and approved by the General Assembly to specifically fund legal services. But
and I know that was an issue that was kind of open to interpretation when the work group first met. But now, my understanding is the Treasury Department has issued new guidance, making it clear that a pretty decent chunk of, especially ERAP 2, can be used for legal services. So anyway, I look forward, again, thank you for working on this, and I look forward to working with you on the future on all these issues, but particularly trying to get some of this money to fund our first in the nation legal assistance right to counsel program. But thank you.
Okay, next question goes to Delegate Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to both of those panelists for your information. I was hoping you could walk me through a little bit more how it actually works on the ground when a tenant is seeking assistance. Do they seek it on a monthly basis, and then if they're approved, they get assistance for 1 month, and then they have to keep reapplying, or is it in a larger chunk? How does that work?
Yes, thank you for the question. They are allowed to apply for up to 12 months in arrearages at one time, and an additional 3 months of forward-looking rental assistance. And for ERAP 1, there's a maximum amount of 15 months of assistance. And for ERAP 2, there will be a maximum amount of 18 months rental assistance.
Thank you.
Okay, Delegate Ruth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Gilbert and Mr. Heckles for this presentation and for all your work on this issue. So the ERAP funds, if I understand right, are basically divided into two pools. Part of it goes to the counties and part of it is in the Advanced Housing Relief Program. Is that right, or are there other pools?
Yes, that's right. There's what we call the Maryland Eviction Prevention Partnership, which is the $192 million that's been deployed to the local governments and their partners, and then $40 million that's focused on and deployed by DHCD for tenants in affordable housing developments we financed.
Thank you. And so for the Advanced Housing Relief Program, where it's paid directly to the property management companies in a bulk payment, is there any requirements as to how they divide that, and any way to ensure that all tenants are covered by it?
Sure. So, and I'll take that one, Carol. Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's at the federal level, we're still required to go to the tenant to establish eligibility. So even though we're batching, and it's really batching to those management companies, they still have to go to their tenants and establish eligibility and record the delinquency that's owed to them. So we're just expediting the process by having, for example, if the management company can certify, their income because of records that they contain. We are not doing as much of the bureaucratic process because we have a relationship with those management companies. We will go out within 12 months and inspect the property, inspect their files for compliance and so on. So we're rolling some of that into our existing relationship with these properties, as opposed to requiring that all of that be submitted up front.
Okay, so the landlord is checking eligibility based on the federal guidelines. Is that what I understood you to say?
Based on our program guidelines, but at the federal level, the federal regulations require us to determine eligibility at the tenant level. So the tenant has to be income eligible. The tenant has to have a very specific rent delinquency that is reported to us by the management company, and then we disperse the funds as a result of that.
Thank you. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just to add that most of the developments that Matt's team finances can only be occupied by people with incomes at 60% or below AMI. So those funds are reaching the lower income segment.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And so the eligibility is used to determine the amount of the block grant. Is there any guarantee that the funds actually go to those eligible tenants?
Yes. So in our program, we require that the management company, actually we take a step further than just the extinguishing of the rent that's delinquent. We require that the management company consider the tenant to be current. So even if we're only able, for example, this happened more in the last iteration of the program, but even if we were only able to cover 3 months of rent delinquency, but they had 6, the management company was required to consider that tenant current in order to receive our assistance. So yes, they wipe out any delinquency, fees, rent, anything else that's accrued for that tenant, and they get a clean slate moving forward. Great.
And I think that answers my next question, which was, is there any requirement that the landlord not evict the tenant? But if they're required to bring the tenant up to date, then that would address that, right?
There'd be no delinquency reason for an eviction filing.
Okay. And are there any other requirements on the landlords who accept this money? Just curious.
Yeah, we have a full agreement with the management companies that for them to accept the payments, for us to transfer the payments. So again, we have an existing relationship with all of these management companies on the financing and compliance side, but this is a new agreement that we entered into to formalize the process of dispersing funds to them and what they're required to do in order to receive the funds.
Thank you so much.
Delegate Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had a couple of questions about the slides you showed, Ms. Gilbert. In your slide, you said that the funds would pay 12 months of the arrears and 3 months at a time. So does that mean that if somebody is behind 12 months, you would pay them pay 3 months at a time, so they have to apply 4 times? And tied to this, before you answer this question, you answered a question earlier that there's a cap on you would pay up to 15 months of somebody's rent. And then you said something about 18 months. So I was kind of confused what's 15 and 18. And also my question about the 12 months and 3 months.
Sure. ERAP allows us to catch a renter up on as much as 12 months of arrearages. So that's the maximum amount of back rent that we can.
Back rent. Okay.
We don't do it in 3-month tranches. It's the full amount up to 12 months. And then they can also get an advance of a 3-month commitment once they're reestablished as eligible, income eligible, for a maximum assistance of 15 months with ERAP 1.0 funding. For ERAP 2.0, there's a maximum of 18 months assistance.
Now, when you say 18 months and 15 months, is there a dollar number of how much you would pay over these 15 and 18 months?
That's right. There's not in Treasury, that is a federal statute, there's not a maximum dollar amount.
So Baltimore City is capping it at 25,000. Did you know that?
I think individual programs can make decisions based on the pots of funds that they have coming to them directly, but for our program, we're not capping the amount.
And then a comment was made that about the property management companies, but that is only limited to properties that have been built with DHCD funded housing, right? It's not for everyone, which leaves out the majority of the small.
Yeah, you're going to hear soon in the next panel. I believe you're going to hear from the United Way of Central Maryland, which I didn't have time to applaud as one of our key partners, and they have a bulk rental relief program for private sector landlords. So we have sort of divided that focus. At DHCD, we focused on assisted affordable housing, and United Way is focused on private sector landlords that are housing lower income households in the Baltimore region.
So one last question. You think that it would not be easier to allow the landlords or the property management company in other type of properties which are not DHCD funding to also apply on behalf of their tenants? Because like Delegate Stewart mentioned, it's kind of a hair on the fire kind of situation where we tend to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. And I see a lot of senior citizens, people who are at the on the lower end of the income spectrum, not having computers or not having the ability or time to apply, even though they might be facing eviction. So don't you think that it would be easier and quicker to use this money before it lapses by giving the same privilege or same opportunity to somebody who might own a house or two houses and hasn't been paid for a year and is maybe even facing foreclosure, and the tenant wants to get the money but just doesn't know how, maybe because of the years and age or whatever. So have you thought about opening this not just for DHCD funded properties, but for everyone?
All landlords, no matter small or large, are allowed to apply directly to the local funded programs for relief on behalf of their tenants.
They are?
They are.
Now, whether there's a DHCD funded property or not?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, if they decide to enroll with us, they have a relationship with us. But if they're not a DHCD funded property, they can go directly to the local program to enroll.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, next we have Delegate Terrazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so just to clarify, that's 12 months. It's up to 12 months that the counties or whoever's giving it out can give. The counties can give less than that, right? Because my understanding, at least in Howard County, is we're giving a lot less than that. Is my understanding. Maybe it's changed, but I thought it was a maximum of 3 months.
That's true. That's true. It's just an up to amount, but it doesn't. Not everyone is going to be that many months behind.
Well, no. What I mean is, it's not based on how many months behind, but how much money the county has in terms of how many people are in need.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what is the wait time on these applications? Is there a long wait time, and what can be done to fix that? Is that part of what the problem is, getting this money out?
Well, we're in regular contact with our local governments. I don't have that information as to processing time, but we will find that out. I think the key thing is the basic eligibility requirements for a household being eligible for assistance does take some time to pull together. And it really, these are federal statutory requirements. We're not adding to that burden, but it is a processing issue for the programs.
And you're working with them to try to cut that down, is it? Because that's part of getting the money out, right?
Right. We are in constant contact with TA, technical assistance, to make sure they're not doing more than they need to be doing.
With the courts or with the counties, you mean? With the counties and cities?
With the
Okay.
county programs
So-
that we're funding.
So just in terms of like the publicity money that you were talking about, I'm wondering if since you're working with the courts and with the counties, I was wondering if there had been if that money, that ERAP money could also be used to maybe make those judgments electronic sooner. I know that there's been discussion of that, but just in terms of making those judgments available to the people with the money, because it seems that I know one of the judges, or Judge Morrissey maybe said one of his employees or somebody had received a postcard, but I don't know how broad you're being with the postcards, but they're not going directly to the people who have judgments against them at this point. And so I'm just thinking of how are we getting the money? How are we getting the information to the people who are about to be part of the tsunami, I guess is the question. And part of the problem, my understanding from Chief Judge Morrissey was these are on paper, so there's no way to get that specific information to the people in the counties, and we haven't talked to them yet, and we will. But how do we get that information? So I guess, is there a role that you guys can play in that? And also sort of in the White House's call for state eviction diversion programs, and that might play a big part of that.
Right, as Judge Morrissey noted, our secretary is in very regular contact with him about how we can reach folks who are in the pipeline, and we collected a number of different databases. I believe one was from the courts that have automated information, but I will have to get back to you on specifically whether we have reached out to folks in the courts pipeline.
Right.
But,
I guess my question to him, and it came also from my discussions with advocates, was that getting that money directly to the people who need it, who are facing eviction, who are part of the tsunami that we're worried about, is very difficult. You're doing sort of a broader based publicity or marketing campaign, which I really appreciate. Every bit of that is helpful. But if we could get directly from the people who are pending eviction because they have a judgment against them and they're about to go through a 21-day warrant, they're going to have a hearing in 21 days, they're going to have a warrant against them. The question is, how do we get that information? My understanding from Chief Judge Morrissey, and maybe that's a further conversation, I'm happy to be part of that if I can be helpful, is just that those are on paper. So we can't get that information to the people who have the money.
Yeah, we do, all of the court self-help centers know about their local programs. But each person who's at that stage of potential eviction does still need to apply to a local program and get qualified as income eligible. So there is still,
of course they have, right.
Direct them to the right place.
Right. So my question is there a way to get it to the people who have the money who can then do the outreach rather than you paying for broad-based outreach to the whole state or the whole county or whoever, to get it to the people who have the money who can then each outreach directly to the people who are facing eviction rather than those people who are clearly were in crisis and now are in major crisis, having to take the proactive step of trying to figure out what's available. But I'll leave it at that. And I appreciate any kind, and maybe we can have a conversation offline about that, but I'd really love to see more done in that vein. And maybe the work group is already talking about that and I'm just not aware of it, but I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for the information.
Okay, we have 4 more questions from the Vice Chair, Delegate Healy, Delegate Lehman, and Delegate Boyce in that order. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Carol and Matt, thank you for your very good presentation. My question goes to your list of counties and the amount of money that each has distributed so far. Looks like Prince George's County is far and away distributed the most direct tenant assistance. Anne Arundel County is second. Others are, have distributed much less. Do you have, based on the track record of the counties, do you have any suggestions or thoughts as to why, say, Prince George's and Anne Arundel are moving so much more quickly than the other members of the Big Eight?
Yeah, and I'll just add that we did receive late breaking information from Montgomery County that there should be an additional 5 million added to their bar chart there. Prince George's County has just been very proactive starting last year in setting up programs with a particular amount of assistance. So they had a well-oiled machine. I just think some of the other counties are really just standing up in the spring, a program that can accommodate the kind of scale and scope that this funding can allow. But I'm going to ask Danielle Meister if she has any additional thoughts on that Delegate Vice Chair Stein's question as to
Sure. Yeah.
advice
Yeah.
to counties that aren't as fastly spending.
Yeah. So most of the counties that you see that are a little bit lower, I think it's important to remember that this slide only captures spending under ERAP awards that went directly to counties. So there, you can see a lot of discrepancy because some of the counties are using other local funds right now to pay out their applications. So for example, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, they all allocated a significant amount of local and direct federal funding from other non-ERAP sources that they're still working with. And when those funds exhaust, then they're going to be switching over to ERAP. So the level of spending mostly is tied to, what kinds of funding sources those counties are using. But this slide just represents what's been spent under ERAP specifically.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's not reflective of total spending is what I would say.
Yeah, is there any way to cobble together different funding sources to reflect what counties have been doing overall?
Yeah, we're actually working on that to have the global view from 2020 through now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Delegate Healy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I have just a few questions. One of them is kind of along these same lines. Do you have a chart that shows not just the money, but the households assisted in each jurisdiction for comparison purposes? A lot of the slides were really focused on the dollars, which really makes a lot of sense, but just to see the impact on households and including how many households are still in the pipeline waiting that have applied or have been identified but maybe even haven't applied. If there's some kind of description of the pipeline in terms of actual households that are in need of this kind of assistance. Do you have
excellent question. And those two data points are required by Treasury. So our reporting to Treasury, which will next be due in the first week in August, will include those data points. And we can get that information broken down by jurisdiction for funds they've dispensed prior to ERAP.
Okay, that would be great. And if you could also, at some point after this, send to the committee copies of all these slides so that we have them for reference in the future. Then the last question I have is really about the role of the landlords in outreach. I'm not sure that was clear in the discussion we had about the landlords. Are there landlords who are voluntarily or have been brought into the loop of doing the outreach, especially the larger ones that know a lot of tenants that may have issues starting to bubble up?
I think you'll hear more on that from the United Way of Central Maryland, which has a STEP program focused on the larger landlords. But our mailings out to landlords, that is to say to households, were to census tracts with the highest concentration of renter households of a lower income. So we mailed out more than 600,000 pieces of materials to very targeted census.
It just seems like it's in the landlord's best interest for their tenants to be able to pay the rent. If they're facing these, different financial problems because of COVID. So they could also be, they have access to their tenants in ways that that you don't as an agency.
Right. And our materials are, they're downloadable. They can be printed out by landlords and distributed to their tenants. And we'll just make sure that that's clear and visible.
And do you have numbers on how many landlords are doing that?
I don't. I think that might be something that the Multi-Housing Association, might be able to help us with.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Delegate Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick. So my first question, Assistant Secretary Gilbert, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to know, first to clarify an AMI question, which was you had said a few minutes ago something about 60% AMI. In your slides, it said 80%. Is it 80 or 60, or does it depend on the form of assistance, the program, and who set that threshold for AMI? Was that the feds or the state or who?
Yeah, the federal, Congress through its statute set the 80% cap. That's a household income can't exceed 80% of area median income. The 60% I mentioned has to do with those properties that are financed as affordable housing by DHCD. Most of them, particularly those that are financed by the low-income housing tax credit, have a income cap of 60% AMI. Also, the federal statute says that we need to prioritize households of 50% or lower AMI. So that is also a requirement of our local awardees to make sure they're reaching, in their applicant pool, the lowest income applicants.
Okay, great, thank you. And my next question is about accountability for landlords. Can you describe, is there some quality control mechanism to figure out whether landlords or how landlords that receive money directly are then using it to ensure that they, are using it the way it was intended, either for tenants or for their, purposes to make up for lost rent? How is that going to work? Because I'm very concerned about that.
Yeah, that is definitely an important monitoring issue. The federal statute does require that the landlord alert in writing the tenant for funds received, and we're further requiring that they, document that has satisfied a certain arrears through a certain time. Danielle, did you have anything to add to that question and point?
Yeah, the Treasury guidelines require us, and then therefore our grantees and subgrantees, to issue a letter or written notification to every tenant when a payment is made on their behalf to a landlord. So they are receiving a notice of how much assistance was provided, what months would have been covered for that assistance. So at that point, if the landlord, doesn't actually use the money to pay down the rent arrears on their ledger or on their notice for the tenant, then the tenant would need to pursue, the legal process for ensuring that rent essentially counts towards their debt. So.
Okay, so to clarify, are you saying, we talked earlier about being concerned about federal clawback of these monies if they're not spent in a timely way? Are you saying there is literally no clawback provision for landlords who misspend this money? It's the burden is on the tenant to prove that's hard to believe, frankly.
Well, it would be fraudulent for a landlord to not follow through and pay the arrearages as outlined in the letters that the awardees are sending to the tenants that are assisted. So we do need to monitor that is happening.
Okay, next question goes to Delegate Boyce, and the final question will go to Delegate Chalisi, and then we're moving on to panel number 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this presentation. Delegate Lehman had asked, I think, my question about fraudulent, and I think fraud on both levels. So, but my question was about the actual payments of rent. Is that 100% of the rent, or is there a certain percentage of the rent? I know last year when we had some certain programs here in the city, it only paid, I think it only paid like 80 or 85% of the rest, and the 30% or 15 or 15 or 20% had to be waived or forgiven. Can you clarify that? Or is that
For
just up to
landlords
the
and
local
tenants,
program?
right, for landlords and tenants that apply directly to the local governments, we are not setting a cap on the amount of arrearages other than what we talked about is the cap of numbers of months. The United Way of Central Maryland, which you'll hear from soon, has a different and a very innovative partnership with larger landlords that, you know, they're satisfying a very large amount of arrearages, and they've asked and gotten approval from their landlord members to forgive 20%. So you'll hear more from the United Way on that program.
Understood. I guess my final question was just understanding the ERAP 1 and 2, the 15 months. It's up to 12 months with the additional 3 months being the 3 months current or the 3 months ahead that can't be paid that they would apply for.
Right. Look, and just as another example, let's say somebody with only 6 months in arrearages, they would have an additional, you know, 9 months. Sorry, yeah, that's right, 9 months to total 15 months in forward-looking payments if they qualify in 3-month tranches.
Okay. Okay. And is there an ability to your earlier conversation with Delegate Lehman about, you mentioned the local providers send the tenants a notice by mail stating that the rent has been paid to their landlord through the program. Is there a way to also send those electronically? Like to an email as well?
Yeah,
Danielle, I was just going to explain. Yeah, I just clarify. It's not a requirement to send it via mail. So depending on the county's program, they might choose to send that via mail, or they may do an electronic copy, just depending on kind of what their infrastructure looks like.
Okay, thank you. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much.
Final question goes to Delegate Jalisi, and then we're going to move on to the mammoth third panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to direct your attention to the same slide that Vice Chair Dana Stein asked you about. If you can put it up for the committee, that would be great. That's the one which talked about how much money had been spent from this ERAP program. And specifically, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you put up that slide so the committee can also see what I'm...
local,
yeah,
38
local
million.
usage, right? So what I understand from your previous slide is you gave 24.7 million or thereabouts to Baltimore County and 17.7 million to Baltimore City from the ERAP 1 program. And what you're showing is Baltimore City has not used a penny of that money, and Baltimore County has only used 1.6 million. Am I getting it right?
So this slide, there were 8 large jurisdictions listed here that got a direct allocation of 143 million. It didn't go through the state. It was direct. So this slide is how much they have spent out of their direct allocation.
Right. So of that 143 million, Baltimore City has not spent a penny, and Baltimore County has only spent if I see it correctly, 1.6 out of a total of 24.7 million they got directly. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Danielle mentioned in her response that a number of these jurisdictions are still spending CDBG, ESG, and CRF funds that were allocated last year before moving into the spending of ERAP funds.
I understand. My specific question is about this slide.
Yeah.
Is that what it shows?
I think she's answered that with respect
to
that.
My question is about the ERAP program, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to know Baltimore City is not spending any money, or if she's saying that they are not spending any money from the ERAP when it's about to expire in September. If that's what she's saying, I just want a confirmation, sir.
Yeah, Danielle may have more recent guidance, but I believe the city is just starting to spend their ERAP funds.
And Baltimore County has only spent 1.6 million out of a total of 24.7 million. Is that right?
Of their ERAP funds, but they will be represented on the next.
We are only talking about ERAP funds which are about to expire in September, ma'am. Is my understanding correct, ma'am?
That is the information we have, but I hope
Okay.
the next panel will provide more
Thank you very
information.
much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so that should do it for panel number 2. Thank you very much. Let's move on to panel number 3, which is pretty big. So we have the following groups that are lined up to speak to us. The Maryland MACO, which is going to have the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services, Baltimore County Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Baltimore City Community Action Partnership. Then we're going to hear from the United Way of Central Maryland. Then we're going to hear from the Maryland Municipal League, and that's going to be the representatives from Colmar Manor, Annapolis, Gaithersburg, Frederick, and Laurel. So let's start off giving 5 minutes to the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services. So let's welcome Ilana Branda to the committee. Ilana, welcome to the Environment and Transportation Committee.
Thank you so much for having me. I am going to share my slides. I believe you all have a copy of them in your packet, so I am going to have some of them up behind me, but given some of the questions and conversation already, I will talk mostly off the slides, but of course happy to answer any questions pertaining to them. So first, I just wanted to give a snapshot of where Montgomery County is with our spending. So we have just under 120 million to use for rental assistance. You can see that the different funds that we have allocated towards that purpose here, and it includes all the ERAP funds also. Our overarching philosophy has been trying to target those resources to households at the greatest risk. We did develop a homeless prevention index that we have been using to prioritize processing of our applications. Our application is an online portal only, but our acknowledgement of those with literacy, language, connectivity barriers. We have set up a call center and we will help anyone walk through an application. We also have staff that is doing outreach at properties. We have trained property managers to assist tenants in completing those applications also. We also have staff at the courthouse every day that they are hearing eviction-related cases to assist any tenant coming in there. We have received at this point over 8,300 tenant direct from tenant applications and another about 2,000 landlord applications that we have not yet been able to match to a companion tenant application. Our portal does allow for applications from both, but we will process it once we have a tenant application. We are processing applications based on 3 priority criteria. We are processing those with evictions to make sure that we are ahead of the eviction curve. So every application with an eviction noted that we know about has already been assigned for processing. We are very fortunate here that our sheriff's department has taken aside one of their staff members who is digitalizing every writ that is scheduled for an eviction for us and sending that list over to us. So we are cross-referencing and matching that with our application and mailing out a notification of the funding opportunity for those that have not yet applied for assistance. So just some of the things that kind of have kept us up and have been working through is we did start putting out rent relief assistance back in May of 2020 with the original county funding. We have done a lot of evolutions to our program to try to make sure that we are continuing to improve and target our program. So in between our local and CRF funds and the ERAP funds, we did take some time to really revamp and reorganize the program, purchase new software, brought on about 30 new staff and train them to be able to really move these applications forward. From our perspective, it is a pretty intense process. We don't want to leave money on the table, but we also don't want to incorrectly award funds too. And as you may have seen, Treasury has continually changed the requirements multiple times. And there are, some things that we're looking out for in terms of really making sure we're not duplicating benefits with all the various programs going on and matching those exact months to the payments there. I will note one thing with the limits on assistance, as was discussed before, that you can only pay those 12 months of arrears. On average, we are paying only 5 months of arrears. That's what the applicant's coming with. And so we can't go back more because they've already paid that, whether they had funds, used savings, had some employment income or whatnot. And so there is a catch-22 in terms of the speed of the programs versus the amount of money that you're getting out the door. So just wanted to call attention to that. So here is where we were as of July 19th. We are spending dually from both of our ERA direct funds from Treasury and the ERA funds that we have received from the state of Maryland. So we're putting about half and half is going to each one. As of last night, we were at over 10.51 million that had been approved. That represents over 1,000 households that have received their funding. And I know it came up in terms of the September 30th deadline to hit that 65% mark. So as of July 19th, we were at 33%. With our spending over this past week, we are above 46%. And we continue to feel we are on target to meet that 65% goal before the September 30th deadline. So there definitely was some ramp up time as the team got trained, as we went through this new system, but we have moved along pretty quickly at this point. So and just so you can see a little bit of, in terms of our recipients and the applicants, we are doing awards up to that 12 months of arrears and the 3 months of perspective at one time. We do have a cap of 12,000 for assistance for households earning between 31 to 50% of area median income. Our program does cap at 50% of area median income. We felt we had enough demand in Montgomery County to have to pause there. And for 30% or below, we will go above the 12% if we can get.
If you could wrap up, that's 5 minutes. So.
Okay, yeah, so for 30% or below, if we can, we will go above $12,000 if we can get the landlord to forgive 10%. And with that, I will pause.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, let's recognize Terry Hickey, who is with the Baltimore County Department of Housing and Community Development. You have 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, other panelists. I'm going to try to quickly share my screen as well, Mr. Chair, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead. Okay, we see it.
All right, great. Let me just do slideshow. Okay, I'll run through this quickly. So much of this is cumulative and so much of this experience is not unique to individual jurisdictions. So a great deal of what Alana just presented, I think, holds true in Baltimore County as well as many of the others. So I'll try to skip to more specifics. I do think it's incredibly important to look at the patchwork of funding. ERAP is the big conversation now, but early in the pandemic, when there was less guidance over what funding could specifically be used in eviction prevention work, we really had to stitch things together. I think what's been talked about before is how this has evolved over time. So Baltimore County has allocated back to the beginning of the pandemic almost $5 million in county and state CARES Act funding. We chose to put a significant amount of our CDBG CV funding, which, to the question of how the counties are spending ERAP, we just finished spending out most of this $5.9 million in CDBG. So we're making the conversion over to ERAP funding now, which sort of explains the 1.6 million on the slide. I think something we're going to get into throughout, the requirement of 65% in September is an obligation commitment. It's not an actual payment commitment. I think jurisdictions have spent a great deal of time, I know we have, looking at exactly what the Treasury means by obligation. And so, for instance, as I go through the different sub-programs we're working on, the United Way has already committed well over $10 million to landlords that's going to be paid out in the next several weeks. We have pre-qualified commitments as we switch to ERAP funding of well over $1 million from our smaller nonprofit providers. So the next round of reports, I think you're going to see significantly different numbers throughout jurisdictions across the state. It's been talked about our just under $50 million in ERAP, both directly and from the state. ERAP 2, the allocation to Baltimore County that has a more long-term time frame, is 19.6, showing almost $80 million in allocated expenditures. You've got this. I won't go through it too much, but I think the key here is that from the very beginning, Baltimore County chose a bifurcated strategy. We worked with the United Way back early on in the pandemic to design the STEP program, which you're going to hear a lot more about from the United Way. So I'll just give a few quick hits. But you can see that we've broken up our large pot of funding almost equally between a tenant-based eviction prevention model, which has been running in some form or fashion back to June of 2020, and our STEP model, which is now in phase 2, currently utilizing almost exclusively ERAP funding from our direct allocation and from the state. Very similar to Montgomery County, our eviction prevention program, we've done it through nonprofit providers. You apply to a very simple portal through the county website. You're then referred to nonprofit providers. There's currently 7 of those. It took quite some time to get the contracts in place and to get providers geared up towards this new model of highly rapid processing, particularly without actual evictions in play. So again, like Alana said, we've had to work through a number of training and technical assistance issues, work through different funding sources for different lengths of time. We have had 8,800 plus a few unique intake forms back since October of 2020. Those are referred to those nonprofits, as we mentioned. There's a number of things that we've done in the last few months to try to increase effectiveness and speed, to be honest. Like Montgomery, we've opened a call center. We've hired additional compliance staff on the back end to be making sure that we avoid duplication of efforts. We're coordinating with our United Way program to make sure that any tenants in this waiting room with active intake forms that live in an apartment building covered by STEP is moved into that model, which is moving more quickly. We've launched a separate program that's driven money directly to voucher clients, which is eligible under ERAP 1. So anyone that is on a housing voucher that's having a problem paying their own individual contribution, we're doing that directly through our Office of Housing. Constant focus on the data and what we're seeing in the individual applicants that are applying and how we can adjust our outreach and our ways to make this faster and more efficient. Just some quick thoughts on STEP. You're going to hear more about this in the United Way.
Start to wrap up here because you've just hit the 5-minute mark.
Got it. That goes quick, huh? Just to let folks know, I want to emphasize when it comes to STEP, for the current program operating now, just from a sense of scale, 81 properties have joined the program, $10.7 million in requests, representing over 1,100 households, and I think you'll see how this is going to play out over the next coming weeks. And then, Chairman, real quickly, I just wanted to mention, you heard quite a bit about this with the Chief Judge's presentation. We also have lawyers that are going to be and are at the courthouse, and I think this issue of reserve judgments and working with our local courts when the dockets open up for landlords to come back in to certify these reserve judgments, having that as a direct pipeline into our eviction prevention program is going to be essential. So I'm sure there'll be questions, so I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we turn to the Baltimore City Community Action Partnership. Angela Whitaker, you have 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. I will also share my screen, and for the sake of time, I will focus on particular slides, and I will start with funding. And just want to elevate, like my partners who spoke before me, we did have a mix of federal, state, and local allocations, and each district or each funding source had different timelines and eligibility requirements. To date, we have received a total of $37.7 million. And we've also, like Baltimore County, allocated funding to United Way to administer their STEP program, which I won't again go into since United Way is also on the panel. But to date, we have allocated $16.2 million to that effort. We are also anticipating an additional $24.3 million while we receiving that from the state, haven't in the process of finalizing that grant agreement. And we've also anticipating 23.1 million additional federal dollars. So I want to talk a bit about distribution. I know that has been brought up, but to date of the other funding sources that we've had, we have dispersed $18.2 million. We have dispersed $13.5 million to individual tenants, and previous to our partnership with STEP, Baltimore City had run a quasi landlord bundle on its own, and we have dispersed $44.7 million through that initiative. So to date, we have assisted 4,000 plus households. We have all 14 city council districts have been represented. And additionally, through very intentional partnerships with agencies such as MEMA, SEDC, and CASA, we have supported 400 applicants from the immigrant community and paid over $500,000 to landlords and tenants in that community. So I want to close just talking a bit about the challenges, which in many cases aren't any different from the partners that we talked about, but just want to elevate that one of the challenges is that there was a disproportionate demand for rental assistance pre-COVID. There were large numbers of residents who were suffering from or in danger of housing instability prior to COVID, and there was immediate surge in the demand once COVID hit. Our applicants really do require a high touch, and like Baltimore County, we have installed a call center to support that. We have installed drop boxes at all of our sites for our applicants who don't have internet access or are suffering from the digital divide, so that they can bring in paper applications and submit their their qualifying document, eligibility documents there. The multi-funding sources and the different requirements, and the initial focus has been really on low barrier eligibility. And then we have also been experiencing evictions still taking place. Other challenges are the varying in processing times just because of the high touch requirements of our community and the growing demand for support. Some of the ways that we are addressing that is we again have installed the call center, the drop boxes, we have added additional staffing capacity and are still working to do that through temp agencies and through our HR departments. And so we are trying to have multifaceted touches on how we bring in additional support. And we've also engaged the partnership of United Way. And then we are recently starting partnerships with other nonprofits, specifically in the immigrant community, so that they will be processing their own applications. And finally, we have updated our software where applicants come in and apply to align specifically with the requirements of ERAP. And we worked with Neighborly to do that. So everything that is required by ERAP is already in the portal. And the final update to that portal is that either a tenant or a landlord can start the application. But again, we won't process the application until we do have the input from the tenant. And so in the interest of time, I'll close there and say more when we have period for questions.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to next recognize the United Way of Central Maryland because they've worked very closely with a selected combination of counties. I'll then entertain questions from the committee. And then after that, we'll get to the MML panel, which is 5 cities, each of whom are going to use 2 minutes. So Scott Gottbrecht, who's the Vice President of Housing and Senior Program Officer with the United Way of Central Maryland. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, but if you need a little bit extra time, I'll allow that. So Scott, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Today, I want to talk about specifically our ERAP funded programming at United Way of Central Maryland and talk a little bit about our model for our STEP program and our rollout timeline and our strategy for the coming months. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. So I think it's useful to understand eviction prevention programs as falling roughly into 2 camps. So on the one hand, there's tenant-based eviction prevention programs, and those are programs in which the tenant will submit applications and then bring in the landlord as part of that process to validate the amount that's owed and contribute their share of the documents. Another model that that's being implemented across the state in various ways is landlord-driven models, where the landlord is the primary collector of documents and submits the documents on the tenant's behalf in order to draw down the rental assistance funds. United Way of Central Maryland operates both types of programs. We have extensive tenant-based eviction prevention programming, but most of the ERAP money that has been allocated in our direction goes to our landlord-facing STEP program model. STEP stands for Strategic Targeted Eviction Prevention. There are essentially 3 features of the program that make it distinct from traditional tenant-based eviction prevention programming. The first, as I mentioned, it's landlord-driven. That means the landlords do the document collection, they interface with the tenants, and they submit those documents in a single moment up to United Way of Central Maryland. That's our program. I think it was mentioned before by Carol that in our pilot, we had asked for 20% forgiveness from landlords. Recognizing though that there's a lot of work involved on the landlord side to collect these documents, we got rid of the 20% requirement with what we're calling STEP 2.0, which is the STEP efforts that have begun since June throughout the Central Maryland region. So there's no more 20% forgiveness requirement because the landlords have to have a lot of skin in the game. One of the things we realized with this model is that landlords are stakeholders. They want to be part of the solution. And so one of the insights of our program is to essentially allow the landlords to ask the landlords to do what case managers are doing in a lot of the tenant-based eviction prevention. So case managers spend a lot of their time tracking down tenants, faxing documents to landlords, getting folks to submit their documents. We ask the landlords to do that. And so our team can focus on document review, error correction, and facilitating things to move towards payout. So it's essentially like we've deputized property managers to play some of the same roles that nonprofit staff or agency staff would play in other circumstances. So in essence, we activate dozens, if not hundreds of property managers to be part of this document collection process so we can focus on the expert work of making sure that we're in compliance with the federal rules so that we can pay out on an accelerated timeline. The second feature of the STEP program is that we do bulk or bundled eviction prevention assistance. So landlords will submit every account that is eligible within their apartment community in a single moment. And then we write a single lump sum check for all of those at once. So we've written checks for $300,000 to stop 60 evictions at the same time. What I liken this to as an analogy is when you're painting a room, you need a paintbrush and a roller brush. Your roller brush handles your bulk or batch areas, and your paintbrush handles the individual cases, the hard to reach places, the gaps and fissures, and you need both for accurate coverage. So our model is the bulk roller brush approach that works hand in hand with the tenant-based approaches that are existing in each of these counties or jurisdictions. And so combined, we're able to provide the best coverage to a county by providing bulk assistance along with individual assistance where needed. And the third feature of our program is that it's targeted. We focus on priority zip codes as recommended by the Urban Institute tool mentioned previously, and data from local health departments and housing agencies as to where the greatest need is, where evictions are happening, where poverty is the deepest. And so we roll through a county in a logical order driven by data to focus on the most vulnerable households first. Our Step 2 model can provide up to 12 months rental arrears under the ERAP law. and utility arrears plus 3 months of forward rent when needed. The $4 million pilot we conducted in Baltimore County ended in February 2021, and we now have $48 million of ERAP funds for the Step 2 model. Here's the breakdown of those funds by jurisdiction. Anne Arundel, and I've also outlined where the source comes from. You all have this document already, so I won't belabor the table here, but it rolls up into $48 million of funding. Most of it comes from the funds that DHCD has pushed back out to local jurisdictions for their eviction prevention efforts. As I mentioned, the pilot concluded in February of 2021. In June, we launched the Step 2 model in Baltimore County. We have also in June hired 12 employees to roll out the program. 4 more employees have been hired and are coming on this week and next. And we're also hiring for 8 more positions in the coming month to bring the staff for the program up to 24 staff people implementing this program across the region. We launched in Baltimore City, Hartford, and Howard in July. And then in August, we'll be launching in Anne Arundel. We've had up to $16 million of submissions in just the past 6 weeks. We are really ramping up rapidly. Last week, we approved $500,000 or $500,000 in payouts. We expect to do the same this week. And by the time we get up to full swing, probably in September or October, we'll be paying out between $1 million and $2 million per week in assistance to help these households. We expect to serve about 4,000 households. On average, we're seeing assistance requests between $10,000 and $12,000 per household. Our program is really designed to assist the most highly impacted households that without this sort of assistance will be evicted when the moratoriums are lifted. And as I mentioned, we're ramping up our staff capacity quickly. The other thing I just want to mention is that our paradigm is pretty unique. We are a carefully crafted tool that's designed to move money quickly and efficiently to areas where the need is the greatest. And so we essentially have a triage model where we look at an entire county, look at all the zip codes that are available and triage where the assistance goes. I think one of the challenges that a lot of jurisdictions have faced is that they're taking applications from everyone all at once, and that creates massive backlogs and long timeframes from submission to payout. And that's definitely one mechanism by which money can and should go out. Our approach really kind of lines up all the zip codes in a logical order and rolls through them in order of priority based off of data so that we don't get too backed up and so that we can continue to focus on the most vulnerable areas and households. So in a very real sense, our program is driven by data and objective measures for strategically targeting eviction prevention where it's needed the most. So I'll stop there. I now realize I'm at the end of my time. So thanks so much for the time today.
Great presentation. Before I start to recognize members of my committee to ask questions of the people who've testified so far, I have to say, Scott, I really liked your analogy of a paint roller versus a paintbrush. I thought that was a really astute way to play it. So, and I think that's right. So, okay, we have so far 3 questions: Delegate Jalisi, Delegate Ruth, and Delegate Healy, and Delegate Terraza, and others who are popping up. So let's first go to Delegate Jalisi, and this is for either the 3 counties or the United Way of Maryland who have testified so far.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our first question is for Mr. Terry Hickey of Baltimore County. You have about $70 million in ERAP funding. Can you tell me when you actually got this money?
So the money, so there's 2 pots of money. The first pot is the direct allocation.
Right, the direct allocation, the $70 million you showed?
The 24.6 for ERAP that came in, that was the first, 24.7, sorry, Delegate, that came in first. That was paid out by the Treasury and then had to go through a appropriations process in Baltimore County. So we had the permission to enter into contracts towards the middle of May, I believe.
So May 17th is the date that DHCD is showing. Is that the date you got the money?
We would have gotten the direct money a little bit earlier. I can check on the exact date, but we weren't able to spend it until we went through appropriations. Okay.
And second question is, you mentioned something about 65% has to be committed, but not necessarily paid out. So what is your timeline for actually paying the landlords so the tenants can stay in their homes and not be evicted? What's the timeline? How many days does it take for the landlord to get the money?
So once the tenant, so there's two different pots, right? So we're putting roughly half of our money into the individual tenant portal, which you've asked a lot of questions. Let me focus on that one. Once it's referred to a nonprofit provider, once the tenant provides the required documents, and once that is certified, which shouldn't take any more than a week or two, the landlord's paid almost immediately. We've done cash advances with the ERAP program to our nonprofit providers, so they don't have to come back to the county to ask for permission to pay the landlord. It works pretty similarly on the United Way piece, where we've sent this money. We just did, I think, a $5 million advance to the United Way. And I think it's important for the committee to note the guidance on obligation has changed. Originally, the guidance on what obligate meant would have been to have been contractually bound. So the money in our contracts that were set up to these providers and to the United Way. Where the guidance stands now, which just came out last week, is that the money doesn't have to be in the banks of the landlords, but it has to be committed in some form or fashion. So
no, but that's not the issue that helps the landlord who's facing foreclosure.
Totally.
I mean, my target has been to prevent foreclosure as much as eviction. So if a landlord who rented part of his duplex to a tenant who has not been able to pay rent and now is facing foreclosure, it doesn't help him to have a commitment but no money in the account. So my question again is, what is the lead time after everything is submitted to the money that gets to that landlord who's renting his or her basement or one of the apartments in his duplex?
Assuming that the landlord provides the appropriate documentation for us to send the money, it would happen in a matter of days.
And then second question is, are you also paying the tenants directly? Like Baltimore City said they paid $13.5 million to the tenants directly, not through the landlord.
So we took a good look at that at the beginning of our program. Carol Gilbert was correct. It is authorized under the ERAP legislation. However, we've focused on a direct landlord payment model. If our call center gets a call, if any of our legal providers get a call indicating that there is an issue with the landlord accepting the money, we will make a case-by-case determination to pay the tenant directly. I want to note, Delegate, it's still unclear to us whether or not direct payments to tenants can count as income. And so we've tried to avoid placing that burden on the tenant. It's also much easier with our documentation process to avoid fraud or duplication of benefits on the landlord side. But again, if we reach a situation where for some reason the landlord, and it says this in the guidance, it's really meant for landlords who are refusing to participate, we can pay the tenant directly. And then we will also connect that tenant with a legal provider so that they can make sure that the tenant's right of redemption is honored as part of the potential eviction process.
Thank you. And then my other question is to the Baltimore City Community Action Partnership. Before I ask my question, can you clarify if this is a Baltimore City government organization or a nonprofit? Ms. Angela Whitaker?
Yes, this is a Baltimore City agency under the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success.
Okay.
But before you go to your question, can I clarify one thing?
Yeah, sure.
So we did not, and I'm sorry for the confusion, we did not yet pay any funds directly to a tenant. So the 13 million that I referenced was 13 million to our tenant facing program versus the 4 million to our landlord facing program. So the 13 million was allocated to tenants who initiated the application process. The 4 million was to the program where we implemented, where landlord initiated the process. And so we are much in the same place that Terry just talked about, with still making a decision relative to how we pay out in the cases where we engage the direct payment to tenants.
So now my question, if you did pay a payment to the tenant directly, how would the landlord know of the payment? Because the tenant, because of financial difficulty, may or may not pay the rent. And also in order to dismiss any court proceedings, the landlord would need to know, because otherwise it will be a violation of state law to continue with the eviction when this payment has been made to the tenant. So are you keeping a database?
So we will keep a database. It will be in our neighborly system. That's part of the challenge in that, because once we give a check to a tenant, we don't know how we could force them to say, you have to take this to your tenant, right? So that's
You mean to the landlord?
To the
Take it to the
landlord,
landlord.
correct, thank you.
Right.
So that's a part of the challenge that we're still working out with the Baltimore City legal team, like all of the red tape and how do we enforce it, but it will be in the neighborly application portal.
And then one more question, Mr. Chair.
Well, hold on, I just want to clarify something in your answer. Did you say that you have the database or that you are going to create the database?
So we have a neighborly application portal. That's where the tenants or the landlords come into the system to apply. And that's where we will keep how we paid out, if we paid out directly to the landlord.
So you do currently have a database. You're not.
That exists.
Okay, go ahead, Delegate Chalisi.
The second question is, you made several references to the money that is available or allocated to the immigrant community. What can you specify? What immigrant community? Are you going to everyone who's an immigrant or just undocumented immigrants?
So
can you specify what is an immigrant community in your understanding, or for my understanding?
Yeah, sure. So it is the undocumented community. It is the documented community. What we have done is we've partnered with MEMA, and they have made suggestions to us about nonprofits who are really like trusted in the community. We have a CAP center in Southeast who historically have not engaged the services that CAPS provide. So we leaned into those partners so that they can help us to reach those communities. And so it's documented and undocumented.
Okay, and then I think just a comment, not a question as much. Do you know that the disbursement when a tenant applies for money? I talked to the department yesterday in Baltimore City. They're not giving a deadline of when the payment is actually going to be made. Like if a tenant applies for rental assistance, and I mean, there has to be some lead time. I mean, there has to be some way to enforce that, like the Baltimore County said, within a few days. So let's say even if it's 2 weeks, can you specify if you have a plan to implement this so that we are trying to get rid of these eviction cases? And if there is no deadline or no lead time, my understanding is then how will you comfort the landlord that the payment is coming in certain number of days?
Yes, so we do have a plan to address that. We have, as I talked about during the presentation, we have added staffing capacity. We are in the process of adding additional capacity so that we are able to process applications quicker. And what our goal is to process applications within 30 days. If there's an imminent eviction, we do have an escalation process to process those cases within a matter of days.
So 30 days on the outset, but maybe sooner.
Yes.
Okay. And that's already in place, or you're planning to get to that point?
So we are closer to that point. Most of our applications are there, but we won't fully be able to get to that point until we add the additional staffing capacity, which we are in the process of doing now. We're conducting interviews and bringing staff on in waves. So we have some who've already started and have additional staff who'll be starting in the coming weeks.
And the last thing is, like United Way said, are you requiring the landlords to forego 20% or 15% or whatever of the rent that is not paid in order to participate in the program as you're enforcing it?
We are not.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we have 4 questions so far in this order. Delegate Ruth, Delegate Healy, Delegate Terraza, Delegate Wells. So let's go to Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be quick. Thank you to the panelists and Mr. Gilbert. This question is for you. You said that the landlords apply for a block of units essentially, and then you process that as a block. If there are more people after they apply who come into arrears, can they reapply with another block?
Yes, great question. So we've designed it so that folks can, the landlord communities can submit supplements. So if there are folks that missed the original deadline for submitting that batch, they can submit in the next wave. There's also folks that become eligible for the program or who become behind on rent after we've sort of swept through that area, and landlords can submit what we're calling a digest every month or two of tenants who have now become eligible for the program or who missed the deadline for whatever reason. So they can certainly continue to apply. We hit our economy of scale when we do it in batch amounts though. So usually in each jurisdiction, it's slightly different, but we ask that landlords submit 3 to 5, at least 3 submissions in their subsequent follow-up supplement, so we can continue to get that economy of scale, that sweet spot of moving money quickly and efficiently.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Before I recognize the next delegate, I have a question. When these checks are cut, how are they made out? Are they made out to the tenant, to the landlord, to both? How are the checks made out?
Was that question to me, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, let's start with you.
Sure. So almost every eviction prevention strategy in the country pays to the landlord. And that's because they're the ones to whom the debt is owed. What folks were referencing a moment ago was that the ERAP law allows a provision in cases where the landlord is not cooperating or is hesitant to receive the assistance, the payment can go directly to the tenant. And that's what folks were talking about before. But by and large, I'd say 97% of eviction prevention dollars go to the landlord because they're the holder of the bill and invoice.
Yeah, I agree. That's the way it ought to be done. Okay, Delegate Healy.
Mute. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. My question is about this triage and using the zip codes. I know that for many years now, a lot of jurisdictions have been working very hard to reduce the concentration of poverty. And I'm wondering if you've seen in the data if any of those efforts have worked, if there's still such an extreme difference from place to place, and are the jurisdictions that have been successful in reducing concentrations of poverty being penalized in this process?
That's a good question. So I have not seen tremendous success, and I'm a researcher in this space. I have my PhD from Hopkins in essentially housing and homelessness studies, and I have not seen any jurisdiction successful at deconcentrating poverty, in particular racialized poverty. And that's why our program really tries to hit those hotspot communities. The funds are allocated across the counties, not according to density of need. And so whether or not, let's just take Howard County, for example, let's say regardless of the pace of their deconcentration efforts, they still have their $4.5 million allocation. You know, each jurisdiction is a little bit different in how they prefer to proceed, but there aren't folks that are being penalized for not having concentrations of poverty. We're going to get to everybody, by the way, in a county. We're rolling through the whole county. It's just we're doing it in a certain order just to make sure we're getting to where the greatest need is, the greatest intensity of need.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 3 remaining, Terraza, Wells, and Holmes in that order. Delegate Terraza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the county folks and to the United Way of Central Maryland. I know the county folks, I really appreciate, county and city, I apologize. I really appreciate all the hard work you're doing and putting this together and working as fast as you can to get the money out to the people who need it. I just really quickly want to know, and I'm just trying to understand this in terms of the tsunami of evictions that I'm concerned about. What is the time frame? And I know you guys are doing everything you can to do this as fast as possible, but what is the time frame that we're talking about between the application or the submission and the application to the payment? Like what's our average time frame look like? And if we could just go through all 3 of you, I'm curious about that in terms of what that looks like for us going forward.
Sure. Go ahead, Alana.
Okay, thanks. I unfortunately don't have our average time frame, and I think what's really challenging about that is, as I mentioned, at least for Montgomery County, and I believe many other jurisdictions, we're not doing first come, first serve, right? We're doing a prioritization based on is there an active eviction proceedings occurring? Do they meet the Treasury guidelines of having someone in the household unemployed for 90 days or more? And we are using our homeless prevention index to target the hotspots also. And so there are applications, if someone submits an application today and they already have a judgment for an eviction, we're going to pick that one up, we're going to prioritize it, and we're going to get it processed. And that may jump them ahead of someone else whose application may have been sitting for 30 days, but has no eviction filing against them. And yes, there's tremendous anxiety in housing crisis, but it is not at that imminent point of housing loss. So I can say, for us, on average, each application, we're with each application anywhere between 5 to 8 hours. And that is spread out sometimes across a couple of weeks, because we also need to provide, per Treasury guidance, we need to provide the landlord time to respond if they have not already engaged in the process. And we are giving the opportunity to the tenant and the landlord to cure any missing documentation that we might have. Once we approve an application, that check is out within 48 hours.
Okay, so just really quickly, and I totally appreciate that you're prioritizing that way, and I'm definitely not questioning you're doing that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and you guys are the ones on the ground looking at it. So if somebody is in crisis and is facing eviction, so these people are coming, their judgments now, and they're about to be entered, and then we've got whatever the 21 days, I apologize, I don't remember exactly what it is, but I guess 21 days while they're facing before a warrant is issued. How long would those take from submission to approximately? Or is that still, are we still talking about a few weeks for those? And I understand that other people have applications jumping up. I'm just trying to get a sense.
Yeah, so a lot of it honestly depends on how complete the application is when we get it. We purposefully allowed our applications to go through the online process without having documents uploaded, so that if someone needed to call us up and have assistance completing that application, that it wasn't preventing them from getting their information in. So then the worker may have to follow up and with text messages, or we have drop boxes available too, and collect any necessary documentation. So we try to work, like I have seen cases where, as I mentioned also, we're very fortunate that our local sheriff's office is giving us a digitalized list of those hard copy documents. So we share that list with our workers if the case has already been assigned. And if it's not assigned, we get that assigned right away. I have seen some of those. It could be 3 days and we're ready to cut a check. Other ones, if we can't get in touch with the person, it can be on average 2 weeks easily that it takes.
That's very helpful. And Mr. Hickey, then.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking the question, because I think this right now, I know there's a lot of need to focus on the deadline that the Treasury has given us, but it's this is what I think is keeping us up at night, is the wait. And so the way I've been explaining it in Baltimore County is, like Montgomery, we created an incredibly simple document-free intake form that gets you into a waiting room. Our job, we brought temps on immediately. They're calling 500-600 people on that list a day and continuing to go out in waves. Now we're starting to look for people that have court summons or eviction notices. We're getting lots of calls into 311 for people that have gotten their initial court notice, and we've wired in all of our legal service providers, the court self-help, even judges, even bailiffs in the courthouse. Everybody is sort of thinking along those lines. If you have a court summons, we'll connect you with legal services paid for by the county within 24 hours once we know who you are. And we have a tenant advocacy group, so if it's a quasi-legal issue that we don't know quite what's going on with the landlord, they'll do the vetting for us. That's Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland. And then if we find out that you have an actual eviction notice, once we get word of that at our call center, within 24 hours, you're referred to a provider. That provider will have a promissory note or payment. Right now, generally a promissory note, just to make sure that the landlord stops moving forward within 2 to 3 days max. We've done 375 emergency referrals in the last month. almost all of them are cases that were filed at the beginning of the pandemic. It's the stranglehold on the courts right now that are almost providing just enough respite for us to stay ahead of the actual, see, this whole tsunami, it all comes down to this. In each individual county, can we stay ahead of the rate that these are being converted, right? And that's a very different, very pronounced calculus for each of us.
Right, that's my concern, is that as soon as the floodgates open, even though Chief Judge Morrissey is saying, and I completely believe him, that they're going to be slow to get back up to speed, there's definitely going to be a floodgate open on the 15th, on the 31st, and then on the 15th or the day after, whichever it is. And that's my concern, is will you guys be able to then stay on top of that, and what needs to be done to help make sure that what do we need to do, or what needs to be done by the state or whoever to make sure that you're still able to stay ahead of that.
Right.
Exactly what you were saying. And I really appreciate the point you were making. And that's what the conversation that I think needs to continue, but obviously not now because we're short on time. But but I do want to continue that conversation with you. Miss Whitaker, you as well. I really appreciate your work on this also. If you could just, thanks.
So for those, we also have
let's hold on. Let's move on to the next four people who have talked.
Okay.
Delegate Wells, Delegate Holmes, the Vice Chair, and Delegate Jalisi in that order. Melissa Wells next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all the presenters from across the various regions. So I have a couple of questions, just kind of like, I think I'm grateful for my colleagues on this committee because I think we're always asking good questions and it's always kind of spurring additional thoughts that come to me or I think come to colleagues. But one of the questions I had though was for United Way, for Scott. And I just wanted to kind of understand your model a little bit more. I understand that part of this is more of a clarifying question because there's so much policy and program that's wrapped up into this conversation, and it's not always easily digestible via the slides. And so, Scott, I just wanted to understand a little bit more about specifically, I think you said the bulk or bundled assistance, how that works with the landlords, and also kind of tying in a little bit, how does that work with also our partnerships with some of the tenant and legal service providers? So if you could just give me a little bit more, because I think my concern is more of how are we tracking the individual who's receiving the benefit for that unit itself, if it's coming in bulk?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, no problem. So when we go to a new zip code, our partner, the Maryland Multi-Housing Association, has worked with us to identify all of the large apartment complexes or apartment communities that are in that zip code. And then the Maryland Multi-Housing Association has been a fabulous thought partner and implementer in getting this model out and bringing landlords to the table and helping us to negotiate and make sure that our system is operating smoothly. So the landlords are invited to an introductory webinar. After which we send them kind of all the paperwork, which is extensive. The federal law is complex, and the requirements as far as data points and documentation are onerous. The landlords are given after that 2 to 3 weeks to turn their submissions back around to us. They submit a kind of a invoice cover sheet that has, for each household is a different row. And they say for that household, how much they're asking for in utilities, how much they're asking for in rent, and whether or not they're asking for prospective rent if a household is continuing to experience a financial hardship. And that's kind of their cover sheet. And then for each household underneath that cover sheet, it creates a big stack or a bundle, as we call it. Each household has 4 to 5 supporting documents that the landlord has collected: their income document, their household information form, their demographic sheet, their declaration of hardship, any sort of self-certification of income, things like that. And so at the end of the day, let's say they have 50 households. That means they have a stack of documents they've submitted that's 200 plus pages of documents. And then we review all those documents, and then we send them back a kind of what we call a finalized invoice, which is like where we've said, okay, we reviewed the documents and the ledgers, and in fact, we're going to pay out this amount, for this household and this amount for this household. And then we send that to them as essentially a promissory note. And we say, here are the amounts that we're paying for each household and where the funds need to be applied. And then we, after we send that to the landlord, we call each and every tenant and notify them of the award, the amount that's going to arrears, to utilities and prospective rent, We answer any questions they have. We send them an email with the determination letter that has the breakdown, and that functions as their receipt of that transaction. We also provide them an FAQ document that tells them what to do if they feel like there's a discrepancy on their account, and they can call us to resolve it. And built into the landlord agreement, every landlord signs an agreement with us as to how these funds will be applied. If we say that if there's any discrepancies or the funds are used incorrectly, the landlord commits to returning the funds to us on problematic accounts. So there's a clawback mechanism within our arrangement with landlords, if there's any shenanigans, if you will, that we can recoup funds that have not been applied correctly.
Thank you. And then I might be a little bit confused in terms of the operation, because I know that you're working closely with Baltimore County. I know that now you guys are working with Baltimore City, Hartford, and a few others. I guess what is the process for deciding whether or not Baltimore County is, I'm using Baltimore County just as an example because I'm not picking on you. But I guess what's the process for determining whether a Baltimore County agency would directly take care of the application for the assistance versus United Way would take care of the application for assistance? Help me just understand the mechanics of that.
So just generally speaking, the STEP program is going to move faster than a tenant-facing program because it's in bulk, because the landlord's doing the document collection. It means the nonprofit case managers in Baltimore County don't have to do the runaround and chase down the tenant and fax the documents to the landlord. So the preference, generally speaking, is that if a tenant is in a STEP participating apartment community, that tenant gets referred over to the STEP. Now they have the option to stay in the tenant portal if they want. They got their spot in line. The W knows better than the W don't. They just want to stay in the tenant portal. They can opt to do that. The preference is to move them over to the STEP framework just because the structure of the program means it's going to move faster. Terry, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you nailed it. Plus, we allocated separate pots of money, and we've been able to move money quickly into STEP so they can get served more quickly. But this gets complicated, right? At the end of the day, if you don't know, apply through the portal and make sure you're in that waiting room. That's what we've been telling you.
No, I think you answered that question perfectly. And then the last thing I wanted to ask is, I know I heard from Montgomery County. I think we heard from Baltimore County. I'm not sure if we heard from Baltimore City, but in terms of prioritizing people based on need, especially if they're if they're going to be facing a court date soon, is a STEP program doing a similar process, Scott, in terms of prioritizing, obviously outside of those bulk payments, but is there a similar process in place to prioritize tenants that might be, really on the brink of facing that court date? And also if Baltimore City could respond, because I don't think you were able to respond to that, Ms. Whitaker.
That's a great question. So we've only been up and running for about 6 weeks. We are starting to get a little backed up. Thankfully, we designed our program to where we can just sort of postpone the implementation of the next zip code. In other words, pump the brakes a little bit in order to catch up on our processing. That's part of the program design. One of the things I think is innovative is we can control the pace of rollout. We're now just about to implement an emergency procedure where if the tenant or landlord has a court-ordered action, a legal action that's happening, they can request what we're calling an emergency review. Where we'll look at the documents and say, yes, this tenant's income qualified. They're extremely likely to get assistance. And we have bargaining power at the table with landlords. We have really great amicable relations. And we get to say, that tenant owes $12,000 of rent. And I'm telling you right now, if you hang on for 3 weeks, we've just reviewed this case. We're telling you it's going to pay out. If you can postpone that judgment or cancel that eviction, we'll get you $12,000 on this account. And almost always the landlords have been willing to play ball and accommodate and reach a settlement. Because we're buying in bulk, we have a great deal of bargaining power. And we're finding that that's keeping landlords engaged in the conversation and willing to negotiate.
Thank you. Ms. Whitaker?
Sure. So we do have a priority system in the neighborly portal that I talked about. Once the applicant puts their application in, they are given a priority number, and a pending eviction is a part of that prioritization. Also, if an applicant calls into the call center and they say they have a pending eviction, they email us the notice, then they are moved up as well. Our pending evictions applications are ordinarily processed within a week. And then moving forward, as the courts open back up, we plan to have caseworkers at the courthouse on site to process applications for those individuals who are at rent court.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we have Delegate Holmes, the Vice Chair, and Delegate Jalisi in that order. Marvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Scott, I hate to keep putting you on the hot spot, but it is what it is. I am a realtor and I am a property manager, and I belong to several different organizations of property managers, one of which we met yesterday, the National Association of Residential Property Managers. They asked me to ask you, are you reaching out to other property management organizations to make other property management organizations aware of your scenarios and your programs? The other question that I have is, you talk about payment to landlords. As a property manager, my job is partially to go to landlord tenant court and to file the failure to pay rent on behalf of the landlords. So how are you notifying property managers and realtors like myself that payments are being made so that we don't inadvertently go to file not knowing that you have circumvented the property manager and made direct payments to the landlord? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first part is, how are we getting to the property managers, not the multifamily apartment complexes, but the folks that have scattered site units, a portfolio of properties throughout an area. That's very prevalent in Baltimore City. So we actually changed our model from the pilot to now step 2.0 to where anyone can submit as long as they have at least five households tied to the same W-9. In other words, if we can fit 5 households under a single check, right? Because the whole point of buying in bulk and processing applications in bulk is that we're trying to settle a lot of accounts at once. So anyone is eligible, whether they're a large multifamily apartment complex or a portfolio holder of a smaller collection of properties, as long as they can submit 5 households. So we are able to now work with property management entities. And we've conducted extensive outreach in partnership with Baltimore City. In that context, if they get pinged by somebody that has a lot of cases, they can refer them over to us. And then we've been sending the word out. We just had a press conference announcing the program, and then we're trying to reach out laterally to as many property managers as we can to notify them of the program. If you know of folks, the problem is that they're not organized under a single entity in a very in a way that's easy to get them all at once in a single email chain or list, for example. So we're just kind of trying to have to do it by pounding the pavement and one case at a time and just get the word out as much as we can. So if you have any recommendations, or if you have a list of property managers that you'd be willing to share with us, we will get the word out and we would love to work with them. Absolutely. The second part of your question was, how do we notify the property managers that a payment has gone out? So we send the determination letters to the tenant, yes, but we also send the property manager that sort of cover sheet invoice that we've determined, here are your final amounts. So as soon as we basically reach a decision as to how much we're going to pay out, we simultaneously send notice to the property manager and then also to the tenants. Our program is not making any direct to tenant payments. I know that each jurisdiction has provisions that allow them to do that under ERAP, but our STEP program model is not structured to do that. It's not in our grant contract arrangement, but each jurisdiction has provisions for that. It's important just to remember that we're part of an overall system response. We're one tool in the toolbox. So we do one thing and do it well. And then the rest of the jurisdictions can do the direct to tenant payments if that's an appropriate response. Great questions.
Okay, next question goes to the Vice Chairman, then Delegate Jalisi. Then we're going to, oh God, we're going to listen to MML. Then we have panel number 4. Then we have panel number 5. And it is 10 minutes to 1 o'clock. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for really anyone on the panel. If a tenant who's facing eviction doesn't know to apply for assistance, or the assistance comes too late, so they're evicted, they're homeless, can any of this funding be used to try to rehouse them?
I'm happy to answer that one. Yes, it can. Per Treasury guidance, you can use that assistance for relocation. So you can do security deposit, you can support application fees, you can provide that 3 months of prospective rent. We are doing that in Montgomery County, and we are actually having those conversations even with those households who are still in their homes, because if they have not been able to make a rent payment for 12 plus months, and where their income is now is after our assistance, they're still going to be struggling. We will have that conversation with them actually then and say, okay, we can help you pay off your arrears now, but we can also help you get set up somewhere else that's more affordable. Do you want to, take advantage of that opportunity now? So we have used it in both ways, and the Treasury does explicitly allow for the funds to be used in that way. It also allows for them, as you mentioned, it's someone maybe already got evicted, but again, it can be used for someone who is at risk of eviction to help them relocate to somewhere more affordable, or if someone is already experiencing homelessness, it can be used to help them set up. There does still need to be that COVID financial hardship, of course, connected to the situation.
Yeah, Alana, you covered ERAP too. I think that a number of counties, including Baltimore County, have hung on to a large portion of their ESG COVID money that can be used for services, relocation, and others. And then the legislature approved the state emergency dollars, and we've worked with DHCD at the state level to make sure that we've got a program through DSS to handle relocation and other costs. But we're also trying to convince people. My biggest concern are tenants that get letters from landlords saying they're going to be evicted at some point and voluntarily abandon their property. That is, to me, I know we're all struggling with that, but that's something we have to keep a very close eye on.
I wanted to chime in also briefly. One of the great things about working with landlords is that we can look under the hood of their books and say, show us all of the households that are in your portfolio. Let's say it's an apartment community of 800 units. We can say, show us all of the apartment complex or units that are 3 or more months behind on rent and are going to be evicted. And we can push the program out to those households and offer the assistance before they even ask for it. So in our model, we can be proactive about pushing the assistance out to households that would be evicted. And that's different than the tenant approach that really has to sit and wait for the tenants to decide it's time for them to go out and seek the assistance. And so that's a mechanism that the landlord-driven approaches have an advantage over, and we're able to reach households that the tenant model isn't. And again, they work in tandem, not one to the exclusion of the other, but they complement each other. So we're able to reach households that the tenant-driven model is unable to, and vice versa.
Scott, let me just interject here. I get the distinct impression that the program you're running that is more landlord facing appears to have some significant economies of scale when it comes to reaching out to, when it comes to resolving a large number of potential evictions. Is that basically correct?
Yes, I definitely think so. And part of it is the batch and bundled approach saves on the overhead time. And part of it is that the landlords doing the document collection means that all we have to do is focus on getting the money out the door and error correction. So, in the pilot, we had 91 participating apartment communities. That's as though we had 91 case managers all working to get the documents collected. And so we basically got all the landlords in Baltimore County rowing in the same direction and moving towards rolling up for payout. And that's why we were able to move money just so quickly. We were doing $200,000 a day during the pilot with a staff of 3 people and 2 volunteers. And that's more eviction prevention in one day than many programs do traditionally in a year. And now we're going to have 24 staff. And so we're going to move very quickly. We think we have an economy of scale, but we're not the end all be all. We're one tool in the toolbox. We move money quickly and efficiently, and that frees up the local jurisdictions to use their desperately valuable case managers to focus on the hard cases with documentation barriers or other barriers to housing or complicated landlord arrangements or the mom and pop landlords. That frees up, by handling the easy large cases, we free up the case managers to do the hard work of the difficult spots.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that it could be used exclusively. Dana, are you good, or can I go to Delegate?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, Delegate Jalisi, you're going to have the last question, and then we're going to go to MML.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just out of curiosity, there have been a discussion on a possible direct payments to tenants. But my question is, does the program or any of the programs also allow to pay in situations where the landlord has filed in the rent court, but the tenant is not providing the information that you may need? So can you just also consider payment to the landlords, and even if something is missing from the tenant, to prevent the eviction? Like there'll always be a situation. Baltimore City said neighborly portal. People can go to the neighborly portal, but a lot of the tenants, a lot of the people who live in my district may not be familiar with how to go online and file with the city or the county. Senior citizens, people who don't have computers, don't have internet or access to a smartphone. So is there a possibility that we can do it that way also, or does the program not allow?
So in Baltimore City, we do have provision for tenants who don't have internet access or access to computers. If they call the call center, caseworkers will put the application in with them telling them the information, and then the supplemental documents they can put in the Dropbox or take a picture and scan it or send it to us via that way. Or they can accept a hard copy application that can be mailed to them, and they can fill it out and then submit it in the Dropbox. However, there are critical documents that are required by the federal statute to meet the eligibility guidelines. And so if we don't have those, we aren't able to make the rent assistance payment.
So basically, as I understand, if the tenant doesn't apply or doesn't cooperate, then the landlord cannot get the money or can't apply on behalf of the tenant, right?
Well, that's right, because the ERAP law says the tenant has to sign it, and there's income guidelines. So the tenant's going to have to submit income documents to prove that they're income eligible. So if a landlord has a strictly non-cooperative tenant, I don't see a way that they could get ERAP funds to them.
Even under the emergency program, when the landlord sends you a lease and let's say a petition for restitution where the tenant is going to be put out?
We would
even
still
the emergency scenario that you mentioned?
The federal law and Treasury guidelines say the tenant has to sign the application and has to provide income documents to prove they're below 80% AMI. And that's built into the actual legislation that Congress passed. So I don't know of a way around it unless, Terry or Angela, if you have any ideas for how to get around that.
That's an unfortunate piece. I will say though that, and if the tenant doesn't show up for any of the proceedings, it negates what I'm about to say, but the legal service partners we're working with see this as a potential option for mediation. So if the tenant does at least show up for the hearing in court, if it gets to that point, the lawyers have a direct access to us for funding. And if they can on the spot, delegate, convince the tenant or address whatever fears or concerns they have, that's an imperfect solution to the problem, but it's another layer.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to go on to what may seem like a lightning round for MML. We have 5 municipalities: the town of Colmar Manor, the city of Annapolis, the city of Gaithersburg, the city of Frederick, and the city of Laurel. And for first up, Mayor Sidara Barrow of Colmar.
I'm sorry, I think you muted yourself and I couldn't hear what you were saying, but
I did mute myself. What do you know? So we're going to have a lightning round for MML. There are 5 cities that are going to be talking to us: Colmar Manor, Annapolis, Gaithersburg, Frederick, and Laurel. And unfortunately, each of you is going to have 2 minutes. So Madam Mayor, welcome to the committee, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate everything that I've heard this morning and all the work that everybody is trying to do in order to improve our circumstance. Unfortunately, I am not sure that in the current state of what's available, that what is really needed will be able to help a lot of people. I think that what's missing here, and I guess I'm talking to my legislators more than the agencies, is urging the federal government to understand that there's some missing pockets, serious missing pockets here. I understand that $45 billion was put out for this rental assistance program, and only about $3 or $4 billion has been spent. So that clearly indicates there's a problem. A lot of households, particularly in my community, are subsidized by someone renting a room in their house, family member, friend, or whatever. But that subsidy is what was normal and has become a missing part. And so for a lot of people, there was no mortgage assistance. The moratorium on evictions didn't say there's a moratorium if you only have 80% of the income requirements. It put a moratorium on everybody. So the tsunami is for real. It may not happen in the courts. It will happen on the streets. And I'm urging my lawmakers to take a look at what kind of assistance can really be made available to people who really need it. And we will wind up with a tsunami of the invisible people. And those are the people who don't really have a serious, stable household. And they're everywhere already. And I feel like with the situation not assisting people who cannot document what is expected to be documented by the statute, is going to create a much bigger situation. And so I look forward to, some more conversation about this, and maybe before September the 30th. And I will move on to our next colleague. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Next, we're going to be hearing from Alderman Dewan Gay from the city of Annapolis. Alderman.
Mr. Chair, Angelica Bailey with MML, pardon the interruption. Unfortunately, the alderman had to jump off. So if I may suggest Gaithersburg going next.
Okay, Tom Lonergan from the great city of Gaithersburg then. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'll apologize in advance after my brief comments. I will also have to jump off, as ironically I am hosting a meeting with our community services staff to go over current workload relating to rental relief assistance requests here in the great city of Gaithersburg. But as you mentioned, my name is Tom Lonergan, Assistant City Manager for the city. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of our insights into what Gaithersburg has been doing and what more is needed to assist our residents. Early on, our response to the crisis did focus most acutely on the immediate needs of food and medical care of our residents. As the crisis deepened, we did quickly recognize the dire housing situation that many of our renters would be facing. Our direct client service caseload did increase 365% during the pandemic, serving a total of nearly 1,500 households in fiscal year 21. Gaithersburg's response involves a collaborative approach that has always been crucial to the city's success. Several city divisions are involved, and early on we began convening weekly meetings of housing partners that include city, county, and nonprofit providers to ensure that we are maximizing our resources. Those meetings do continue to this day, including today. We are directing all city residents in need of rental assistance to first apply for Montgomery County monies. Clients are encouraged to return to the city if supplemental assistance is needed, although our funding is limited. Both clients and landlords have expressed frustration with the complexity of the application system, and renters are finding eviction notice processes very difficult to navigate. Language and technology barriers are among the most pressing concerns. We do believe that an effective solution is not just about throwing more rent relief money at the problem. It requires a boots on the ground approach to provide one-on-one assistance to help folks successfully navigate the process. Much like the vaccine effort did move from mass sites to door-to-door connections, so must our rent relief and eviction prevention efforts become more granular.
I'm going to have to start to wrap up, Tom.
I will do so now. As a local government, we are nimble, well-versed in collaborations with nonprofits, and together we have been blanketing the community with resource information. Obviously, this crisis has laid bare our inequities within the communities, but we do look forward to working with our state and county governments and nonprofit partners to help our residents stay in their homes, hopefully here in Gaithersburg.
Okay. All right, great. Next, we have the mayor of the city of Frederick, Mayor Michael O'Connor. Welcome to the Environment and Transportation Committee, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. We appreciate your time today. Really important conversation. And the conversation so far has highlighted really on the two focuses of this. One, we want to protect evictions, prevent evictions, but the other is that landlords who are business people need to be able to make an income so that we don't have foreclosures. 3 quick points I want to try and make in the roughly 2 minutes I have. 45% of the housing units in the city of Frederick are rentals. And so this issue of rental properties is critically important. And we knew when the pandemic hit and people were losing their jobs that this was going to be an area of crisis. So we were grateful for the federal relief funds that came initially, which we tapped through the county. We made the decision then to partner with the county on rental assistance, to not try and stand up in the city of Frederick our own program, but to work with Frederick County. So we combined the resources that we had available in the city and the county, working with a nonprofit partner to help us set up a rental assistance program. We learned some things in the early months of that, particularly language barriers with people who are not native English speakers, some of the technical paperwork requirements, those sorts of hurdles challenge residents, particularly those who are facing a financial crisis. And so we wanted to do the best that we could to try and relieve those to the greatest extent possible. The county is continuing to manage some rental relief through their ERAP funds. Our residents obviously benefit from that in the county, but we're not separately doing anything apart from what we did back at the beginning and the CARES Act funding. The last point is this shared partnership, and I hope this comes across the right way. Our Board of Aldermen in July put a rent increase moratorium in place in the city of Frederick with an elimination of late fees as a result of that as well, for the duration of the catastrophic health crisis and for 180 days following its end. Because I think what we know based on some of the conversations today is there are going to be long haul effects that we can't anticipate. And this burden shared by both the tenants and the landlords is the only way we'll successfully get through this together. So I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And then finally, Christian Pulley, who's the Deputy City Administrator for the City of Laurel. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Once again, I'm Christian Pulley, the Deputy City Administrator for the City of Laurel, and I'm here on behalf of Mayor Craig Edmond today. This meeting has been very informative for me today, and I just briefly wanted to discuss how the city helps citizens with various needs during the pandemic. For financial assistance, the city used funding from savings that we had to create a COVID-19 financial assistance program to assist residents, whether it was for energy assistance to pay past due bills, rental or mortgage assistance, and move-in assistance as well if people were moving from one property to another. In a way for the city to administer this program, we partnered with a local nonprofit known as the Laurel Advocacy and Referral Services, which is a local nonprofit here in Laurel. So they administered the program for us. And we touched roughly about 60 individuals or 27 households to provide extra assistance, financial assistance for those that were in need at the height of the pandemic. Also, like my other colleagues mentioned, we worked with the Prince George's County as well because they had an emergency rental fund for people that were in need of rental assistance during COVID. And currently we're in the process of preparing our ARPA plan to see how we can continue to administer money into the community, whether it's for, housing or different other resources that people may need. And then before I close, last week, we actually held a town hall in partnership with Prince George's County Legal Services, talking about evictions during COVID-19. Know your rights. So I will put that link to the video in the chat because it was recorded and it's on our YouTube page. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm here for any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. There appear to be no questions. So thank you all to MML and the 4 cities that testified. With that, we're going to move on to a 4th panel, which is composed of folks who I think are best described as tenant advocates, and there'll be 3 presenters: Hannibal Kermer and Jessica Kaufman with the Office of the Attorney General, 5 minutes; Carissa Hatfield with the Homeless Persons Representation Project, and then finally Stuart Sims and Douglas Nivens with Maryland Legal Aid. All of them will have 5 minutes. Let's begin with Hannibal. Hannibal, welcome to the Environment and Transportation Committee.
Thank you, Chairman Barbe and Vice Chair Stein, distinguished members of the Environment and Transportation Committee. I genuinely appreciate this opportunity to appear before you and bring greetings on behalf of Attorney General Brian Frosh. As you said, my name is Hannibal Kemmerer, and I want to talk about three different things very quickly. The first is the low barriers to entry for landlords who want to file eviction proceedings. The second is the increased number of complaints that our Consumer Protection Division has received over the course of the pandemic. And the third is the delays to landlords and tenants getting federal funding for rental assistance, in particular, access to council funding, which is allowable under the American Recovery Act and other CARES Act provisions. So for the first point, as many of you are aware, in the 2021 session, the Attorney General had legislation that would have increased the filing fee in Maryland from $15, which it currently is, to $120. The national average filing fee for eviction proceedings is $112, and Maryland is substantially below that national average. We have in my written testimony examples of how the filing rate in Maryland, which is determined by dividing the number of landlord-tenant cases filed in a given year by the number of rental households, is substantially, and I mean tenfold higher than the national average. It ranges in the 80s to 90%. Data from 2016, Mr. Chairman, showed that the filing rate in Maryland counties has sometimes exceeded 100%. So if you only have so much housing stock, there's serial filings that add up to rates exceeding 100%. We've got Baltimore County, Prince George's County, and Baltimore City as examples. Not only is Maryland outside the national rate of filings, it's far outside our neighbors. You can look at Delaware, DC, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia in the written testimony, page 2. And we've heard from opponents to increasing the filing fee that, you know, it's really the right of redemption. It's not the filing fee that encourages landlords to serially file. But as Georgetown, Professor Eva Rosen testified, in jurisdictions that have a higher filing fee, landlords have systematically reported that this fee acts as a deterrent. Even more disconcerting than the 80 to 90% filing rate we saw in the early 2012 through 2016, the Evictions Lab ran the numbers for 2019 and figured that it was roughly 93% filing rate. So that's the first issue. The second issue is landlord-tenant consumer complaints are on the rise. The most egregious of these we recount on the bottom of page 2 through page 3 of our testimony involved a landlord cutting off electricity to a tenant's property and changing the locks. When our Consumer Protection Division got involved and informed the landlord that this was illegal and informed BG&E that there were actual tenants on the premises, the landlord physically cut the electricity lines to the house. So we've had an increase in the number of complaints both onto our hotline and also written complaints concerning evictions. And if you look at the center of page 3 of our written testimony, you'll see that we have more than a fourfold increase for the year 2000 in written complaints. We also have just this year alone through July 22nd, last Thursday, 72 written complaints, where in prior years it was in the 40s. So a substantial increase in written complaints concerning these things. The third and final issue is the significant delay of getting this rental assistance to households, whether it's through the landlords or the tenants. The latest data from the, from Appendix A, which is from the National Equity Atlas Rent Depth Dashboard, indicates that 129,000 roughly Maryland households are rent burdened and substantially behind on rent. Those numbers are current through July 5th, 2021, and are really disconcerting. Since the end of session, after the General Assembly in its wisdom passed House Bill 18, the Attorney General has been writing to both Governor Hogan and the allocation jurisdictions, the Big 8 as they're called, and urging each to allocate at least 10% of the federal funding to legal representation for tenants in eviction proceedings. As this body noted, housing stability services that include the provision of legal representation in eviction proceedings is critical to keeping people in their homes during the pandemic. So we call your attention to appendices B through D. I've already mentioned Appendix A, and I invite questions, but we certainly hope that more jurisdictions will follow Anne Arundel County's example, and what I've learned more about today, Baltimore County's example in providing counsel to people who are facing eviction proceedings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Let's next go to Carissa Hatfield, who's with the Homeless Persons Representation Project. Carissa, welcome back to the committee.
Thank you very much, Chairman Barbet and members of the committee. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go, and share. Great. Hopefully you can see that now, and we'll go ahead and get started. So as has been discussed, excuse me, sorry about that. I hit the share button instead of the present button. This is what happens when you're trying to get it done in 5 minutes. Just briefly, just to discuss, as has already been discussed, Governor Hogan's executive order does expire on August 15th, and any judgments that were entered as a result were reserved as a result will be entered at that point in time. As Chief Judge Morrissey noted, between the executive order and the CDC order, that's approximately 5,500 evictions that are currently reserved that will be entered. Based on the time frame of a 21-day hearing sometime within the next 30 to 45 days. And that's evictions that certainly are important to those tenants, even if it seems like a smaller number to the judiciary. It's certainly something that's important to all 5,500 of those households, that those evictions not be entered. The state of evictions, as you saw, the numbers that we had were through May. 285,647 cases of failure to pay rent filed, and with the numbers of 7,309 breach of lease and tenant holding over cases. 4,600 evictions have occurred since last July. In June and July alone in Baltimore City, 823 warrants of restitution were issued, which meant those houses are now being scheduled for an eviction. As you can see, the numbers did increase significantly from July of last year through this year, with a minor dip as related to the brief stoppage of court cases from December to March. The state of rental assistance, I can speak primarily about Baltimore City simply because we practice primarily in Baltimore City. As they note, as the CAP Center noted, Ms. Whitaker noted, $18.2 million has been issued to 4,000 households. However, the city estimated at the last hearing we were in with them that 28,000 households still have not received rental assistance and are in arrears, and they have not distributed approximately 52% of their currently available rental funds. There's also significant delays in processing. The city reported to us in April of 2021 that there was a 90-plus day review period or pending review period for applications. In our experience, one of the challenges we're facing is that judges are reticent to grant continuances in court cases to follow up or ensure payout from rental assistance programs. They have stated that they don't feel there's a judicial policy that gives them good cause to grant those extensions for 30 days to check on these applications. And this is creating an atmosphere for tenants where multiple judgments are being entered against them, even when they have a rental assistance application pending that could pay $10,000 to $12,000 of their rent. And they're still having judgments entered against them that could possibly result in eviction before those funds are paid. So what do we do about that at this point? What do we do about those households? And where do we go from here? I think the most important thing that we can ask be addressed is eviction diversion, something that we were trying to deal with in the last legislative session. Eviction diversion creates a program that slows down the eviction process. What it ultimately does is open doors for mediation, rental assistance, and legal assistance become more effective and to work more holistically with one another to ensure that tenants are not being evicted when they may have rental assistance pending, when they may have legal defenses or other things that are going to prevent their eviction. Reform of the failure to pay rent process should prioritize rental assistance, should prioritize these mediation and legal assistance processes rather than granting a judgment up front and then trying to catch up at the end and fix it. This just creates a process where we have tenants who shouldn't be evicted who are coming to that edge, and then these programs are having to rush to try to get that assistance to them to make sure they aren't evicted. This creates problems that don't need to be created if we have this type of program. Secondly, we can talk about tenant screening, shielding, and sealing bills. These types of bills help to ensure that tenants who have pending cases against them are able to move if they need to. So if someone has a breach of lease filed against them currently, it's very challenging to move if a landlord can see that you have an eviction pending against you. If that is shielded, then that tenant can move. That case no longer exists and that tenant doesn't have an eviction on their record. And in addition, it allows for tenants who have had valid defenses to have their records of failure to pay rent shielded so future landlords aren't using that against them. And these times of COVID that were ultimately not the tenant's fault don't come back to haunt them in the future when they're trying to rent another apartment.
To begin to wrap up, the committee would appreciate it.
Yes, this is my last slide. And finally, I would just say, collection of rental data. We've had previous bills where we've talked about collection of data related to eviction, but we could also look at collecting other types of data, particularly in light of COVID-19. Things like renter demographics at the time of leasing, average rental costs in the city and the state, and leasing turnovers in addition to eviction data could help us get a more clear picture of what's going on now and how COVID will ultimately impact what's going on with renters in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, we have Stuart Sims and Douglas Nivens with Maryland Legal Aid. Stuart, welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon. And thanks for the opportunity. As the person who stands between you and lunch, I know I stand in dangerous territory. But more specifically, you have my written testimony, so I won't be long. I'm here with Douglas Nivens of Maryland Legal Aid. We have 12 offices across the state and are representing people actively in the district and circuit courts of the state. We do expect that there will be a bubble. These will be very tough cases that will be coming to the courts starting very, very soon. We recognize that part of our problem, particularly in addressing these difficult clients, has been the various counties have multiple approaches with regard to providing assistance. Some thought may be given to providing a standard application or aspect in order to speed up the process. I endorse everything that the previous speaker, Ms. Hatfield, mentioned in terms of some of the new obvious steps that should be taken, particularly in the importance of diversion and the opportunity with courts to take a time out, to take a pause while applications are pending. We believe that the advocacy work and particularly the internal work by Baltimore County by Mr. Hickey and certainly Ms. Whitaker, who I spoke to just last week, has been very important in terms of the process. Also, Legal Aid is now prepared or will be soon prepared to provide mobility throughout the state to try to reach counties that do not have active programs or a strong advocacy group like United Aid to assist. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. Mr. Nivens and I are certainly available for questions, and we thank you for a very interesting set of hours and testimony.
Not at all, Stuart. You're not the only person who stands between us and lunch, so don't feel bad. So we have some questions. The first question goes to, we have a question from Delegate Lehman. Delegate Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Kammerer. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. You mentioned a term called serial filers. Can you help me understand that?
Sure. The Evictions Lab defines it as someone, a landlord who files against the same tenant repeatedly throughout a year. So that's how you can exceed the number of rental units with the number of filings if you file against the same tenants more than once.
So you're saying that, is it the situation where the tenant is not paying every month and the landlord files every month against them? Or are you saying they file for the same month again and again, which I'm sure is illegal?
No, it's the former. But what happens is, and we had a witness testify to this in judiciary. What happens is you'll have somebody who, say, because of their pay date, gets paid after the 6th of the month, and as a consequence, they pay every month. They pay, let's say, on the 8th. The landlord, not taking heed of that, and I guess wanting to file to force their hand and to change the power dynamics, will file on the 6th of the month, get paid by the 8th, and then dismiss the claim. But you've still put the tenant through the process of having a serial filing against them. We had a witness who this happened to 6 times in the course of a calendar year. 4 of those complaints, she never was served because she'd already paid by the time the lawyer got the filing back from the court to serve her. And so, we just want to deter the filing for the sake of filing.
No, but so are you suggesting then, to not be a serial filer, a landlord must collect rent differently for different tenants? Let's say that I have 2 houses. One tenant gets paid on the 5th of the month and the other one gets paid on the 20th of the month. So what you're saying that I should be able to, I need to not collect rent on the 1st of the month and just have my leases go differently for different tenants? Would that not be improper, that I'm asking for one tenant to pay on the 5th and the other one on the 15th?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter that much to the landlord, even if they have a mortgage, whether they get paid on the 5th or the 8th. Now, if you're talking about the 24th,
actually it does, because if the lender wants to be paid on the 10th for both properties, then it does make a difference, because on one mortgage, the landlord would be late and have to pay late fee, and on the other one, he would be or she would be on time. So it does make a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it does in that circumstance, if the landlord's mortgage is due on the 10th, but that would be sort of odd too.
No. Okay,
it would be for me.
Thank you. That's fine. I understand your position. Besides offering this, I also see the word tsunami was used before. Tsunami of foreclosures for small landlords who may have one rental property or 2. Does your office provide any assistance to those landlords who have not been able to pay their mortgages or their property taxes, but especially mortgages, for foreclosure prevention? Or is your office offering something like that?
It would depend on whether it's a commercial landlord or a consumer landlord, somebody but generally speaking, our consumer protection division doesn't provide assistance to business transactions. So if it's a commercial landlord with a mortgagor problem, their bank is giving them a hard time, that would be a business to business transaction and typically wouldn't fall under the ambit of our consumer protection division.
So even if the landlord is an individual and the bank is the bank, you would not provide assistance.
Delegate Lehman, let me restate your question.
Okay.
So let's say I have a house and I'm renting out my basement to a renter who's not been able to pay his or her rent, and as a result, I'm not able to pay my mortgage. Is that seen by the Attorney General's office as a business to business type transaction where you would not become involved?
I don't want to get too far out over my skis, Chairman, but I don't think that would be a business to business, and I think that either the landlord or the tenant could file a complaint with our consumer protection division. But I mean, depending on the county, I would recommend that they go to the various rental assistance programs that each of the counties have stepped up. And I also defer to my colleague Jessica Kaufman if she has a better answer to that question.
Yeah, Jessica.
Thank you to members of the committee, and I'm happy to try to answer the question. There are various programs available across the state, actually, that deal with foreclosure issues. I know the Commissioner of Financial Regulation deals with some of those situations. The mediation unit of the Consumer Protection Division may under certain circumstances, be able to help. But the Office of Administrative Hearings also does foreclosure mediation. So there are resources for, I would say, landlords who are renting out a part of their house to find assistance if they are concerned about foreclosure. But
not the Attorney General's office, right?
Hold on. I'll tell you what my committee would appreciate is if you would research that and write a specific answer to me on that issue.
I certainly could do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Jay, you have another question?
One more question to the Maryland Legal Aid. Same thing. Do you have any facilities for landlords like the chairman mentioned who may be facing foreclosure?
At this point, I certainly can research that question, but we have qualifications for service, and it's unlikely that the individual will qualify for service. However, that does not prevent them from certainly applying for representation.
Is that a yes or a no? I couldn't understand. Could you repeat
Again,
that?
it depends on the circumstances in terms of income.
No, for the landlord, sir.
Sounds like probably no.
Probably, likely no, but again, in terms of their income, that should be scrutinized by the legal aid office in Towson or wherever, simply determine whether or not they could be represented. But
Okay.
Probably not.
Okay, probably not. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I've got a question from Delegate Boyce. Delegate Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for, I think it was Clarissa. She's gone from my screen.
I'm right here.
Okay, it is Clarissa. Yes,
No,
okay.
Clarissa.
So on your slides, you showed Baltimore City in particular that it doesn't seem like we're expending the money, I guess, as quickly as possible. Is there any known barriers, a reason why we're not being able to get the funds to households to be able to pay back rent?
So my understanding from the presentation provided by the CAP Center and in conversations with the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success is that they have had some staffing concerns. They have been understaffed and overwhelmed with the number of applications they've received, which is certainly understandable. I think where the problem comes in for tenants is, for example, I currently have a tenant who applied for assistance in February. Her application wasn't approved until June, and her check is going out until this week. So we're seeing periods where tenants are not getting, and that creates serious concerns for them. Only by the grace of the landlord did they not get a judgment against them in June when they had a pending case. So I think that that's what we're seeing, is that there's some significant understaffing in the city office related to this rental assistance, which it sounds like they're trying to resolve, but in the meantime is creating significant delays.
Yeah, and I think it was a question earlier for the earlier panel, because it showed that we haven't spent any of the ERAP money because we are still trying to spend money that we have. And so it sounds likely that we are going to lose at least the first round of ERAP money because it's got to be expended by September.
Yeah, I think my understanding from the earlier presentations was that it's optional but not mandatory to take the funds back from the federal government. And I think the other thing that I had heard in this committee and wanted to address was there were some questions around whether ERAP payments would be federally taxable for a tenant. And it's my understanding that the IRS has released guidelines indicating that if payments are made from ERAP directly to a tenant, that those are not considered taxable income. So that's a way that we could get around if there's barriers with interacting with the landlord. For example, I have a case right now where that's the situation where the landlord does not want to engage with the program, that there are ways that we could get around that since it wouldn't be considered taxable income for the tenant.
Thank you.
Okay, there appear to be no further questions. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to the last panel, which is made up of the Maryland Multi-Housing Association, the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metro Washington, and Bill Castelli, who's with the Maryland Realtors. Now, my understanding is that MMHA and AOBA will be presenting together. And so I guess you could have, how are you actually, let me not guess. Let me just come straight out and ask, how do you intend to present together? Or are you going to do it separately? How are you going to do it?
Mr. Chairman, MMHA and AOBA have a joint presentation that we can run through pretty quickly.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see if you can do it in 7.5 minutes, and then Bill Castelli will back cleanup. And of course, Catherine Howard is available to answer questions, which is what I understand is the arrangement. So why don't you go ahead and please begin.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. So I'm Grayson Wiggins with the Maryland Multi-Housing Association. It's wonderful to see everybody again. And Aaron Bradley from AOBA is also present, I believe.
Afternoon, committee.
Good to see you. Please proceed.
Sure. So our first couple of slides go through the numbers, but we've gotten a lot of information about the amount of money that Maryland has. So we just want to reiterate, more than $700 million came to the state of Maryland in ERAP 1 and ERAP 2 combined. So when we've again talked about the numbers a lot, but one thing I want to note, next slide, Grayson, sorry. One thing I want to note about the Prince George's County ERAP program is it is largely housing provider driven. The department engages housing providers frequently to apply on behalf of their residents. And the benefit of that, and this will speak to some of the questions that were raised earlier, is that people most at risk receive the help that they need because housing providers have their rent rolls. They know who is delinquent, who is at risk for eviction. And also because they have applied on behalf of those residents, that holds the eviction process up. They don't file because they know that assistance is pending and likely to come. The other thing the other reason that's beneficial rather is as the Department of Housing Community Development data shows, the money gets dispersed more efficiently. In 2020, the Prince George's County Department of Housing Community Development, when they were using their CDBG and CRF money, they noticed they were having some problems getting the money out and went in a resident-based system and having a hard time following up with the residents. And so they contacted AOBA and industry stakeholders to see how they could do it more efficiently. At that time, they realized that it was most efficient to engage housing providers in that way, in terms of the documentation and the data, and contacting applicants. And they've been able to, disperse a lot of money with property managers and housing providers spearheading the process. So next slide. And this is Montgomery County data. We can talk through it, but we've heard a lot, and we had a wonderful presentation from Montgomery County directly.
I thought I actually was the last witness. I must have listened.
Sorry, who's talking right now?
I believe someone was accidentally
muted them.
Okay, you need to be muted if you're not here. Let me just pause the presenters for the moment. Okay, yeah, please proceed.
Sure. So what you have in front of you now is, and you've seen these numbers from other participants today, it's a breakdown of the different pots of money. And then on the right column is, in our minds, a very important column. It's the STEP program allocation. And you've heard about that. And I think what you've heard over the past 3.5 hours, and we're happy to hear it, is that housing providers are a critical partner to the success of the state in regards to rental assistance. And so this is just a background on the STEP program, and Scott from United Way covered it very well. But just to reiterate, we do identify these hotspot zip codes. MMHA and United Way work very closely. We've been working very closely for the last few months to identify housing providers in certain sections of the state that would benefit, whose tenants would benefit from rental assistance. We have meetings every day, or excuse me, every week. It feels like every day sometimes. But we are working hard to connect housing providers and tenants with rental assistance through the United Way program. We've been doing this even as housing providers have been subject to local rent controls that are tied to Governor Hogan's executive order. The Mayor Frederick mentioned one of those. It's important to note that though those policies have created substantial operating issues for our members, they do not end with the state of emergency. They exist for a time frame, a respective time frame thereafter, depending on the jurisdiction. Again, United Way in the program that we've worked with them on, it targets Class B, C, and D properties, which are naturally occurring affordable housing, and they issue bulk payments. This is just some of the requirements that a housing provider must take to participate in the STEP program. It includes dismissing active rent court cases, not creating new eviction filings for at least 30 days, offering to renew an expired or expiring lease for at least 90 days, and removing and waiving any and all late fees, court fees, attorney fees, etc. So this is another breakdown of the allocation of the money for United Way, the 12 months of back rent, the 3 months of future rent. Again, you've heard all of this. It's important to note, and I believe Scott mentioned it briefly, but we're looking at $500,000 in payments were authorized last week. We expect $500,000 this week, and we're hoping to quickly move to $1 million per week in approved funding very shortly. That's only going to benefit housing providers and tenants across the state.
And so this slide is an overview of some of the important updates to the federal ERAP assistance requirements. As we've talked about under ERAP 2, Treasury requires that funding can be paid directly to a resident if the housing provider refuses to participate in the rental assistance program. One of the interesting and important things is that Treasury now allows for fact-specific proxies to be used to determine income eligibility, specifically qualified census tracts, which have been talked about, but that does help with the verification, because that is one of the stumbling blocks that a lot of residents and housing providers share with the organization. And as you can see, funds can now cover up to 18 months of rent and utility arrearages. So while the money every day, we're happy to see more money is getting in the streets in the hands of housing providers. We have some recommendations, right? Better communication with the housing provider and residents about their application status. We don't want people to fall in that lag time between application and funding, and people to lose their housing, to proactively move out, any of those things. And better communication about the status and the backlog and those types of things could help address that. We also have started to see an issue with some funding and some programs going beyond Treasury requirements for documentation. And every time they change a requirement, it pushes the application farther in the back and the funding is held up. And the STEP program, which Grayson can talk about.
Yes, so promoting the STEP program. Sorry, I clicked through and had to go back. Promoting the STEP program. It's invaluable, or it's extremely valuable for us anytime a legislator can get involved with communication efforts. You've heard a lot about the STEP program. If you have more questions, happy to talk about it today or offline. And we could really use your help in getting the message out and getting that information out to your constituents. It's important to note that from our perspective and to our knowledge, not one landlord that's a member of MMHA has refused participation in the program. So there's a high 100% participation record right now. As Scott talked about, all the benefits the program offers to tenants to keep people housed. Please help us get that information out to your constituents.
Great. Are you, oh, you're done, aren't you? Okay, that's terrific. Let me now call up Bill Castelli on behalf of the Maryland Realtors. Bill, you out there?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bill Castelli on behalf of the Maryland Realtors. We had some conversations with some of our property managers that represent about 14, and this is just a select group of our property managers that represent about 1,400 scattered site units across the state, just asking them kind of status of how things are going. And I would say one of the prior folks that testified had mentioned this is, these programs are ramping up. I think that's a good description of it. It's a good description of what our members are going through too. Unlike some of the multifamily, many of our folks are representing a lot of single family properties. So they're not only trying to educate the tenant about these programs, but also trying to educate the landlord about the programs as well. And so there is, sometimes that paperwork and trying to get the documentation by the tenant is also a struggle, trying to get that documentation on the part of the landlord to make sure that they're getting it in there as well. So that ramp up time has taken some time, but from almost everybody that we've talked to of that very select group mentioned that the programs are helpful. There is certainly sometimes frustration getting to learn a new program, but they have found it to be helpful. Second thing I would just mention too is that in terms of portfolios, many of these property managers, because of the strength of the real estate market right now, when you have an owner who has reached enough equity in a property, that strength of the market sometimes is leading them to sell their property, given some of the still uncertain prospects in the future in terms of the eviction moratorium and other challenges that property owners are facing. So there is, with some of the folks that we've talked to, sometimes a doubling or quadrupling of the attrition of some of their portfolio from folks that are just, trying to step out and sell those properties. And that's a combination, again, of strength of the market, uncertainty, and things like that. But I do think these programs and better communication, more uniformity will help preserve some of these units and help preserve some of these folks staying in the market. And I'll end there, Mr. Chair.
All righty then. Well, we've got 3 questions. The first goes to the Vice Chair, the second to Delegate Jalisi, and the third so far to Delegate Ruth. So Dana, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panelists for their presentation. I guess my question goes to your understanding of the number of tenants who are behind in their rent. I think it was encouraging to hear from Chief Judge Morrissey that there are only 4,500 reserve judgments, but then, based on what I've read in the paper, some have speculated that there might be as many as 200,000 tenants in Maryland who are behind in their rent. And so I guess my question to, especially the landlord representatives, Grayson or Aaron, do you have any estimates as to, the number of tenants who are delinquent, or I guess, however you would define seriously delinquent?
Aaron, do you want to start off or do you want me to go?
You start and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah. We do have some internal estimates, and I'm happy to provide those to you in the committee. I can tell you that what we're seeing is that filings and warrants of restitution are way down compared to pre-pandemic years. Additionally, evictions are way down compared to pre-pandemic years. We see that in the data from the district court. I can also tell you, we didn't get to the slide, but another important thing to note is that a filing in Baltimore City right now, we have members who have told us they filed back in November, and the hearing is happening at the end of July and in August. So we have 8, sometimes even up to 10 months in certain jurisdictions between a filing and a hearing. And so we do not anticipate a tsunami. We agree with the district court in that regard, but I'd be happy to get you the information, Delegate Stein.
Great.
So what I can say, Delegate Stein, with regard to the amount of people that are delinquent is that what we do know is that depending on housing type, class, right, asset class A, B, or C, in our C class properties, we were seeing delinquency rates, hovering around 30%. And our B classes, we were seeing upper teens, 18%. And in our A classes, we were seeing significantly lower rent delinquencies, which you would expect, right? Those are our newer luxury communities. And so we certainly know that there is a need for people to receive this assistance. with regards to numbers, I can't be sure, and we can look to get you some more data on what we have. We also know how many households have been assisted, and which we can, is actually in our presentation with data that was on hand. I list a little bit of how many households were assisted, so you can, extrapolate how many houses probably need assistance from there, if that's helpful.
And real quick, Delegate, I just want to add, my understanding is that there's consensus across the board that the state has more than enough rental assistance. We've heard this from some of the tenant lobbyists, and my understanding is the Attorney General has requested some ERAP funds for access to counsel. So I believe there's consensus that there is enough rental assistance in the state. We just have to make sure it's getting out in time.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I could just ask one follow-up question. So, I mean, it's good to know, I guess a question that, some people have been wondering about is with the end of the affirmative defense under the governor's executive order next month, August 15th, there is some question as to whether that would trigger more filings for people who have been, for tenants who are behind. Are you saying you don't think that'll at least appreciably, the number will appreciably increase or, spike because of delays and or the availability of assistance, or, what's your take on what might happen next month?
My take on it is that the courts have been open for filings this whole time, as Judge Morrissey noted. Housing providers have known that. It's not been a secret. I mean, it's been well known in the industry. And so I would not appreciate or anticipate an appreciable immediate spike in the number of filings. I'm not going to forecast that because it is somewhat speculative, but I, from my perspective and from what I'm hearing from my members, I would not anticipate that.
We're also, I'm sorry.
Okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
We're also expecting to really hit our stride with this rental assistance, and that'll also, because again, the predominant reason that filings are occurring are failure to pay rent. Well, if the rent is paid through rental assistance and other means, we don't anticipate a need for an increase in filings. We're really looking to work with I think housing providers, AOB and MMHA represent, not to speak for Grace, but I will speak for the industry that I know. We're looking to work with residents to come out with the best solution possible, and that's rental assistance and getting the money in the streets and on the rent ledgers as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question goes to Delegate Jalisi, followed by Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question to any of these panelists is, we heard in the testimony before that Baltimore City and Baltimore County are still in the process of setting up the ERAP distribution under the ERAP 1 program. ERAP 2 money has not been received as yet. Prince George's County has been great in disbursing this money. So have you been in contact with the city and the county administration to find out why they are so far behind compared to Prince George's County?
So yes, we've spoken with the city and with Baltimore County. We've worked very closely with Mr. Hickey and his staff, again, with United Way. We've spoken with Baltimore City. My understanding from the presentation is that there were other funds that they have been issuing out and getting out to the tenants and the residents. And I'm encouraged that Baltimore City has now allocated $16 million to United Way for the STEP program. That is going to make a critical difference as we move forward. And so we're excited about that new opportunity.
But there's a 90-day review period for these applications. And these applications require landlords to agree to not file these tenant failure to pay rent cases.
Right.
And so how does that connect?
Well, it's part of the United Way program, and landlords have been participating. Regardless of those stipulations, we are here working with tenants to participate in that program. I have a member in Baltimore City who created an impromptu computer lab and began sitting with tenants and filling out applications. That is not rare. That is the norm right now. I have members who have spent countless hours with tenants who are essentially funding case managers, as Scott noted, and they're putting a ton of staff time into this. And we are happy participants and happy partners.
No, but that's not my question. My question is, if there's a 90-day lag time in approving an application and a landlord is required to agree on the beginning not to file failure to pay rent cases, then what would entice the landlords in participating in this program if they have to wait for 3 months for even a decision of whether they're going to get paid or not?
But I think we're confusing somewhat because the United Way program does not take 90 days.
No.
So I'm happy to talk with you offline about it, but it doesn't take 90 days.
Okay, thank you very much.
Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wiggins, you had said you asked for us to help get the word out to our constituents about the STEP program. Can you expand on what that means? When we get, for example, when we get constituents who are, facing eviction, they say they're facing eviction or having trouble paying their rent, we usually send them to the Baltimore County Housing Assistance page. So should we be, if they're in a larger complex, telling them to go to their landlord instead, or how do you?
I would always ask that you ask them to communicate with their landlord. Anything on social media that you can push out about the program is always helpful as well. We do appreciate that. And frankly, if you have a tenant who has an issue like that in your district, you can contact me and I'll look up and see, what's the name of the property and look at our spreadsheet and I'll let you know how they can get enrolled and participate. I'm happy to do that. Some people remember me from the Department of Labor where I used to do constituent services, and I'm all about helping people and getting that message out to the constituents.
Great, thank you.
Okay, there appear to be no further questions, and it appears to be almost 2 o'clock. So speaking for myself, I found this very, very informative. I was very happy to see the charts reported by the Chief Judge. I was happy to hear from all of the local government agencies, but I was especially very interested to hear the details of the program that the United Way of Central Maryland is implementing. And while I don't think that's the exclusive way to deal with the problem, I think that it's a very, very useful it was a very, very useful template for how these things how we can proceed forward. So I suppose I just want to reiterate the fact that this is not the end of a conversation. It's the continuation of a detailed conversation about the facts associated with this situation. And I, of course, welcome anyone to contact me or the members of my committee. We will, especially through the chair of the Housing Subcommittee, Marvin Holmes, will be very, very intently watching all of these developments. There's no anticipation, of course, of us, having well, the anticipation is that if we proceed, it'll be for legislation in the next General Assembly session beginning in January. But in the meantime, I would encourage all the players to get serious about pumping out all this money as rapidly as possible. And so with that, unless there are any other comments from any of the members of the committee, I would of course, I want to thank Trish and Matt for having organized all of this. So unless I hear any comments for the good of the order, I'm going to say that this virtual briefing has been concluded and that we are adjourned. Everybody, take care, and let's just all stay in touch.